Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up, and make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing our Spider-Man week coverage, we pick up with Ultimate Spider-Man and the origin of Miles Morales is the best way to say it. Miles Morales appeared before this particular origin, but he was really just kind of like a kid who was there, and that was really about it. And this is interesting because this brings in really to like Spider-Man Homecoming, the idea of Miles Morales. This video is being made 2 weeks before Spider-Man Homecoming, so I have no idea what goes on in that movie. But I would surmise that Miles Morales will probably appear in the movie, but either he'll be a post-credit scene or he'll just be a kid who's mentioned, and that'll be about it. And the reason why that works is because of the fact that that's what happened in the Ultimate Universe. This whole origin came after Miles Morales first appeared. Prior to this, he was just a kid who was there, and that was really it. There was no expectation that he was going to grow into anything or become anything significant. And it was kind of interesting because to me, there are a lot of aspects of Spider-Man Homecoming that pull directly from the Ultimate Universe. And it's always been that way with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is rooted more in the Ultimate Universe than it is in the main Marvel continuity. There's some differences. I mean, there are some main Marvel timeline things that are folded in. For example, Captain America Steve Rogers is the first super soldier in the main Marvel universe, but he's not the first super soldier in the Ultimate Universe. And that actually brings us into the story of Miles Morales' origin. And the reason why is because of the fact that all of this basically deals with Norman Osborn and Osborn Industries, as well as something called the Oz Formula. Now, the Oz Formula is just one of several attempts in the Ultimate Universe to basically duplicate the original super soldier serum that made Nick Fury. And this is one of the biggest differences when it came to the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe. With regards to the main Marvel continuity, you have what's called Weapons Plus. And Weapons Plus is basically just this organization that serves the purpose of creating super soldiers to battle against credible threats. The idea was that Captain America Steve Rogers was Weapon 1. That was it. But because of the fact that Dr. Abraham Erskine, the guy that was behind the formula that made Steve Rogers into a super soldier, had basically been killed, it was impossible to duplicate his formula perfectly. And so the idea was to try to attempt it, but if it didn't work, to also have backup projects instead. And so what we got were projects 2 through 9. And that was everything from implanting cybernetic implants in like animals, trying to make animals sentient. It was a multitude of just different things that all had to do with creating super soldiers. Eventually it led into Weapon 10 or Weapon X, which gave us Wolverine, which led into like Deadpool and all different kinds of stuff. But all of it was rooted in the idea of Captain America Steve Rogers. In the Ultimate Universe, it's a wholly different kettle of beans. The way it all worked out is that instead of Steve Rogers, Nick Fury was the very first super soldier. But much like Captain America Steve Rogers in the main Marvel universe, the entire basis behind the super soldier serum had basically gone up in smoke. Nobody really knew how to replicate it. But what ended up happening is different organizations across the world began attempting to duplicate it. Of course, in Canada, for example, they were trying to duplicate the process that made Nick Fury into a super soldier, and that resulted in them kidnapping James Howlett and discovering the X gene, which meant that if these X genes were basically unlocked or they were accessed, people would be granted powers. And so once they accessed the powers of James Howlett, then they in turn turned this formula or what have you into an aerosol form, dispersed it across the world, and that's how mutants started popping up. When it came to Norman Osborn and the Oz formula, that was based off the super soldier formula that was used to make Nick Fury into a super soldier. And so the idea was that Norman Osborn was trying to find a way to again create super soldiers, and in doing so began the process of like irradiating spiders and so on and so forth. One of these spiders bit Peter Parker, which led to the start of the Ultimate Spider-Man line of stories. Now, that deals with the idea of like mutants and most of the superpowered community. The idea was that in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, Peter Parker had just gone forward, as a superhero, and he was learning about his powers. With great power must come great responsibility that he was taught by Uncle Ben. Fast forwarding over the course of his publication history, once we got into like 2011, 2012, writer Brian Michael Bendis wanted to shift things up. He wanted to basically remove Peter Parker and put somebody in his place. The fact remains here that in the instance of Peter Parker effectively getting away, the idea of Osborn was to basically figure out what it was about the formula that gave Peter Parker powers in the first place and then duplicate it. Now, of course, this all dead ends into the idea of Norman Osborn being revealed as the Green Goblin and so on and so forth. But then we actually pick up with a guy by the name of Prowler. Now, in the main Marvel line of stories, Prowler is a guy named Hobie Brown. And you may have heard of his line of comics. He got his own solo series as part of All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man's Clone Conspiracy. Really, the big biggest role that Hobie Brown plays in All New, All Different Marvel is he's the stand-in Spider-Man. When Peter Parker is, holding a press conference or when he's in the middle of a meeting or something like that, Hobie Brown is the one that parades around as Spider-Man so that people believe that Peter and Spider-Man are two distinctly different people. Here in this Ultimate Universe line of stories, he's basically just the uncle of Miles Morales. He's just a guy. And they call him Prowler because he's basically just a guy that steals stuff. But breaking into Osborn Industries has its own risks in the sense that you're basically breaking into a multinational corporation. Not only that, in the middle of this heist, the spider manages to make its way onto Prowler, which in turn enters his bag, taking this spider with him. Now, from here, we pick up with Miles Morales. And that's one of the things that I like the most about Miles, is that Miles, the way his story was told, the way it was done by Brian Michael Bendis, he was designed to basically be a character that reflected the real world. And most of the Ultimate Universe was like that. The Ultimate Universe was Marvel coming along and saying, okay, how can we take these characters that everybody knows and everybody loves and update them for the modern day so they could basically get an answer to the question, what if Captain America emerged right now? That was the whole basis behind the Ultimate Universe back when it was made in the year 2000. And so the idea is that Miles Morales is basically in a lottery for a charter school. There was a good documentary that was done a while ago called Waiting for Superman. At least either it's Waiting for Superman or Waiting on Superman. But the idea was that it dealt with like the American school system. And something that a lot of you guys may not know is that in a lot of like inner city schools and really impoverished parts of the country, you'll have like the public school system, and then they'll open a charter school, which is like where you can get the best education in that particular school district. And they'll hold lotteries. Like people will go to like these huge assembly halls and they'll basically start drawing numbers. And those kids who were selected get to go to that charter school. The others are just left to deal with the American school system. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, if they win and they get to go to a charter school, they'll have a future outside of whatever education they get from the American school system being as defunded as it is. So it's not really designed to be like a political statement. It's designed to make Miles Morales relatable. And that's one of the things that I kind of feel like needs to be said, especially right now in Marvel, because a lot of people are looking at the whole, political landscape and so on and so forth. This was written back in 2011. And so while Brian Michael Bendis does have a tendency to be a little political with his writing, this was not designed to be a statement. It was basically designed to say, here's a relatable aspect of Miles Morales, because there are kids that deal with this every day of their life in inner city areas. So again, it's kind of cool here because as a kid who is part Hispanic, part African American, it really related to a lot of young people who were reading his comics because that really feeds into the nature of Spider-Man. Keep in mind, Peter Parker's legacy was formed by the fact that he basically empowered teenagers. He made young people feel like they were the star of the show. And that legacy of Spider-Man lives on because you get a little bit of the humor, but you also get that whole backstory in terms of everything that happened that made him who he was. And so with Miles Morales winning this, we're basically introduced to the idea of his uncle. Miles does not know about the role that his uncle plays in being a thief. For him, his uncle is just an uncle. And so it's really just kind of Miles relaying the news and that kind of thing. But the funny scenario about this too is that Miles was really told in a lot of ways, do not go see your uncle. His father had explicitly laid that out. Do not go see him on the regular. He is not a good influence. Now, of course, again, the whole idea of a thief, but we'll actually learn there's a little more about Miles' dad than we were originally given. There's a little bit of an expansion here. But of course, in the middle of all this, he's basically bitten by the radioactive spider that his uncle had carried home and then suddenly just wakes up. Now, of course, with Miles' dad coming home, screaming at it, at his brother and that kind of thing, Miles basically just takes off. Now, this is when we start to get into a lot of the aspects of Spider-Man Homecoming, just kind of going by the trailers, just looking at what we've seen, with regards to the trailers. And the whole idea here is that Spider-Man Homecoming looks as though it's just supposed to be rooted in like the modern day. It's supposed to be rooted in a lot of like current things that go on right now, again, sort of feeding into this Ultimate Universe thing. But the introduction of it all really kind of comes by way of Miles' whole experience and learning that he has powers. The other half of this is that when Brian Michael Bendis made Miles Morales, had he gone through and made Miles just a total replica of Peter Parker, it would have cheapened it. It would have taken away the impact of Miles being Spider-Man. With Miles, one of the biggest issues that he faces is a combination of just kind of growing up, as being a teenager, and also the idea of having powers. Because remember, one of the relatable aspects of this is just teenage life. And I don't know about you guys, I don't know how many of you guys watching this are teenagers, but being a teenager, I mean, it's in hindsight, it's the easiest thing in the world. But at the time when you are a teenager, it seems like the hardest thing in the world because you're trying to make friends, you're trying to be socially acceptable, you also want to be able to drive around and have your own independence, but you also recognize you're not necessarily ready for the world, but you think you are. There's a million things that go on in your head. I mean, there's college, there's your future, there's a million things rolling around in your head, to say nothing of the fact that you're basically spending, 5 or 6 years going through an existential crisis. Who are you? Where are you going? What's your purpose in the universe? I mean, these are all the things that teenagers deal with on a regular basis. And so this combined with the idea of the sudden introduction of powers makes things a little difficult. Now, the other half of this is a character by the name of Genki. And this is really the whole idea of like Ned Leeds' character being brought in to Spider-Man Homecoming. One of the funny situations and one of the things that fans immediately caught on when it came to the trailer of Spider-Man Homecoming is the character of Ned Leeds. Historically speaking, in the Peter Parker Spider-Man line of stories in the main Marvel universe, Ned Leeds was like a competitor at the Daily Bugle. He was never a classmate of Peter Parker. With this introduction of Ned Leeds in Spider-Man Homecoming, it's basically Genki from the Ultimate Universe in the sense that the two of them relate to each other in the exact same way. Genki is kind of like the comedic sidekick. He's the kid who sort of cheers Spider-Man on, cheers Miles Morales on and says, look, man, like, you're capable of incredible things. But it's also the idea that Genki is going to be the moral compass for Miles Morales in a lot of different ways. But it's kind of cool because instead of just like being terrified, instead of being afraid, it's this idea that Miles could achieve something pretty incredible with the powers that he has. And so in the middle of this whole conversation that he has, with Genki, he's basically pulled aside by his father, taken to a local park, and his father basically explains the reason why he doesn't want Miles spending time with his uncle is because of the fact that his uncle's a thief. And that's one of the greatest things about this particular story is because with Peter Parker Spider-Man in the main Marvel universe, it's, well, Uncle Ben died, and then with great power must come great responsibility, and the moral lessons that came with that. With Miles Morales, it's a lot more visceral. It's this idea that his father basically made a lot of bad decisions. His father stole at one point in time. His father served time in jail somewhere along the line. For him, he looks at his son Miles and says, you've just been accepted to a charter school. You have a future. You can get out of this place. But this also creates a bit of a contradiction with Miles himself, because in his mind, in his imagination, he sees himself being Spider-Man. He sees himself crawling on walls, which he inevitably does. He sees himself saving the day. And that's one of the interesting things about this story is because, once he goes and visits, Genki and kind of tells him everything that's going on, kind of expands on the idea that he can crawl on walls and so on and so forth. And once he actually travels, alongside Genki and comes across a fire in a building, this creates the kind of inner debate, with Miles Morales between what his father's teaching him and what he's coming to understand on his own. His father's looking at the big picture, but his father doesn't know that Miles has spider powers. So in the mind of Miles' father, it's, here's my son who lives in a pretty rough part of town, who's just been accepted to a school that will get him a future. Think of all the things that he could do. He'd become a lawyer or a doctor or a businessman or something along those lines. In the mind of Miles Morales, with the powers that he has, he can save people on the ground level. And that is the inherent difference between what it is that Miles' father's teaching him and what Miles can become. Miles' father is talking about playing a much bigger role, playing a much larger role. But when you're Spider-Man, when you are on the ground floor, when you're saving somebody from a burning building, you don't say, well, hey, we're passing some laws and it's going to make people's life better, and it does. Instead, you see their faces, you see their immediate reactions, you get thank yous, you get, wow, I can't believe you pulled that off. You get the adoration of a community that comes to respect you as you're able to do things that make their lives tangibly better. That's the coolest thing about that, is because it makes it more personal. And so the struggle that Miles faces is that where he does rescue a kid from a burning building, suddenly the gravity of the situation begins to hit him, because now he realized he just saved a human life. And what that means is people will look at him and they will say, wow, that guy's a superhero. Man, that kid's amazing. I can't believe he pulled that off. But now Miles has to come to the realization that the life of other people is in his hands. What if he hadn't acted? That little girl probably would have burned to death in that building. But with Miles Morales stepping in and saving her life, then the question becomes, well, what about the lives that he inevitably just can't save? What if there's just not enough time for him to get there? What about the person who's being mugged or being attacked that he doesn't know about? How does all that play into the equation? Peter Parker Spider-Man in the main Marvel universe deals with that by realizing that while he tries to save everybody he cannot save everyone. You can't be everywhere at once. It's one of the reasons why Superior Spider-Man was so cool, because he was everywhere at once. He had eyes all throughout the entire city. But with Miles Morales, he's coming to realize that you can't be everywhere at one time. You can't save everyone. There are some people out there that you just can't do anything with. And so what we end up doing is we basically pick up with the moment by which Peter Parker ends up dying in the Ultimate Universe. And again, this was a pretty big moment in the whole Ultimate Spider-Man story, just because you got to remember, the Ultimate Universe was basically launched with Peter Parker Spider-Man. And so for about a decade or so, if you were reading Ultimate Spider-Man, you were reading Peter Parker. And the way that he went out was actually pretty amazing. It was like this battle with Norman Osborn, and he basically fought to the point that he died. It was almost like this Superman-esque scenario where it was basically just like a battle to the death. But in the midst of all this, what it does is it basically sets the groundwork for Peter Parker to be removed from the entire Spider-Man mythos, and it allows Miles Morales to effectively take his place. Now, something to point out here is that with Miles being on the scene and directly, speaking with Gwen Stacy really just kind of in a moment of mourning, sort of spits out the name of Peter Parker. But what it does is it basically kind of lights this fire in Miles Morales, because with Miles Morales seeing everything happen, when he sees the death of Peter Parker, he really just kind of looks at this and says, well, now it's up to me to do something. His discussion with Genki is, look, I didn't get these powers, even if that got him by chance. I have to believe if anybody had these powers, they would put them to use. They would live up to the legacy as it was created by Spider-Man. They would live up to everything it was that he did, that Peter Parker had effectively done. And so in the mind of Miles, that's when he begins to really understand what it is that he's meant to do, the significance of the role that he plays in being Spider-Man. Because going to the funeral of Peter Parker, speaking with Aunt May, speaking with Gwen Stacy, it's basically this question that he asked: why did he become Spider-Man? What was the motivation of it? And this is the beauty of this, because Gwen Stacy, immediately, as angry as she is, goes and basically says he did everything that he did because his uncle instilled in him, with great power must come great responsibility. Those with the power to act have the responsibility to act. And that is one of the reasons why the Spider-Man mythos has always been so great, and one of the reasons why it's so important. When it comes to different superheroes over the years, they all have their own moral compasses, their own motivations for why it is they do the things they do. With Superman, it was this idea that he was taught by Jonathan and Martha Kent: if you have the power to stop crime, you should stop crime. In some form or fashion, it was always this measure of responsibility. But with the infamous phrase, with great power must come great responsibility, it made it tangible. We've all heard that, right? Like, do the right thing even if no one is watching, or something along those lines. We've all had that moral compass instilled in us. But to have Gwen Stacy say this to Miles Morales in this way, it lights a fire in Miles Morales, because he's just like, that's true. It's an honest statement. I have these abilities. And so in his mind, while he goes through and designs his own little Spider-Man suit, the idea is, I have to keep the memory of Spider-Man going. And this is actually one of the first mistakes that he makes, because what they do is they grab a Spider-Man Halloween costume and he immediately takes to the streets. Now, this is one of those things where it's just too early, bro. It's just way too early. Despite Miles Morales wanting to do the right thing, his heart's in the right place, the mistake that he makes is that everybody looks at him as trying to be like a copycat of Spider-Man. But people are still in the mourning phase. You gotta keep in mind, with the idea of Spider-Man losing such a hero in such a tragic way, people aren't ready to see somebody just suddenly take up the mantle. They're not ready to see somebody just suddenly become Spider-Man. What they want is time to grieve. What they want is time to mourn. And once that time is passed, then they'll be ready for somebody to take up the mantle. And so at this point, it's just too much, too fast. And so in the middle of this whole experience that he has running around the streets dressed as Spider-Man, he's basically met with the arrival of Jessica Drew. Now, Jessica Drew is actually a pretty interesting character in the realm of Marvel Comics. And the reason why is because she originally appeared in Marvel Spotlight in 1977, I think it was. And she was actually a character who basically gained her spider powers by way of a direct injection from her father. And it was really just a weird circumstance. It was essentially that she had just been, irradiated by uranium that was, across the land and so on. And her father basically tried to cure her of her uranium poisoning by injecting her with a serum that was composed of different spiders, and then putting her in this sort of evolution chamber that was created by the high evolutionary who messed around with the evolution of animals and stuff like that. She woke up something like decades later and basically just kind of emerged with no idea who she was, and eventually joined Hydra or something like that. But with the Ultimate Universe, it's a wholly different kettle of beans. And so Jessica Drew in the Ultimate Universe is actually a clone of Peter Parker. And that's one of the interesting things, is because with her character, despite people knowing who she wasn't so significant in the realm of Marvel Comics that they kind of had to tiptoe around and be careful about what they did. She wasn't Captain America, she wasn't Thor, she wasn't like Iron Man or anything like that. And so because of that, it offered Marvel a little bit of leeway in terms of what they did with her character, how they wrote her, how they designed her, so on and so forth. Also because of the fact that the Clone Saga from Marvel Comics was not a very well-received story for a lot of people. And so the idea of going back and reworking it in the Ultimate Universe was actually kind of cool. It was actually pretty interesting. But with her confronting Miles Morales, this comes by way of the fact that she was basically told by Nick Fury, there's somebody out there impersonating Spider-Man. That happened within, a wholly separate line of stories, but the fact remains that with Nick Fury basically being the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and then essentially having all this information on the life and times of Miles, the cool thing is that there's a conversation that takes place between the two of them, where Nick Fury basically says, look, I know your heart's in the right place. I know you're trying to do the right thing, but people are not ready for a new Spider-Man yet. Give them time. Give them a little bit of time. They'll come around. But for right now, all they see you as is a cheap knockoff because you're wearing the exact same uniform that Spider-Man wore. So if you are going to be Spider-Man, if you're going to be a superhero, then you've got to be different. You can't just be Peter Parker. You've got to be your own character. And that was kind of like an in-comic book statement by Brian Michael Bendis, effectively saying Miles Morales is his own character. He's wholly different from Peter Parker. They're two distinctly different characters. And that was one of the interesting things, is because again, it was hitting home at the idea that he'd basically sort of gone away. And so what ended up happening is that, of course, with Electro, Maxwell Dillon basically being one of the most notable villains villains of the Ultimate Spider-Man making his escape, Miles Morales is single-handedly responsible for basically being able to bring him down. Now, the Ultimates are there, the Ultimate Universe Avengers are there and they do what they can, but it's really Miles Morales that pulls it off through a combination of his ability to make himself invisible and the fact that he issues this sort of electrical touch whenever it is that he engages somebody. Now, the reason why that works is because what it does is it basically sends the electrical impulses of Electro into overdrive and really just sort of hyperdrives him and then just shuts him down. He's basically overwhelmed by his own powers. But, with him being shot dead by Nick Fury as a way to kind of curtail his character a little bit, what happens is it's basically Miles Morales showing the Ultimates that he's actually pretty legit. He's got what it takes to not only be a member of the team, but to also stand on his own 2 feet as his own superhero. Now, at this point, he's not part of the Ultimate Avengers yet. He hasn't really been rolled in as part of the ranks just because, 1, he doesn't have the experience, and 2, they just don't know enough about him. But the first step to allowing the Ultimates to gain more information about him, to see what he's about, is, really comes by way of Nick Fury, who presents Miles Morales with an actual Spider-Man costume based on Miles' own designs. When he was just kind of drawing up these little versions of his own costume, when he was trying to figure out what he was going to look like, Nick Fury basically used S.H.I.E.L.D.'s resources, found this design, I don't know, broke into his home, I have no clue, but took this costume, made it real, and gave it to Miles and said, now go forward and be your own superhero. Okay, so getting into Ultimate Spider-Man, or I guess really Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man, one thing I want to point out here is that in these video titles, I'm simply going to call these Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man, and Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, and so on. Really, the origin story that we did is Volume 1, so this is more like Volume 2. But in truth, this was really just kind of called Ultimate Spider-Man. And then there was another series later on that followed this that was called Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man. But in order to avoid confusion between Ultimate Spider-Man Peter Parker and Ultimate Spider-Man Miles Morales, we're just going to call this Ultimate Spider-Man Miles Morales, so that way everything's pretty clear and pretty easy to follow. But the cool thing about this is that, again, the origin story, for those of you guys who are just joining us with regards to the whole Ultimate Spider-Man landscape, the Ultimate Universe was never designed to be this great, big, huge, grandiose thing like the main Marvel Universe. The main Marvel Universe was really kind of built by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, a handful of other writers and artists in the 1960s and 70s, and then it grew to what it is now, where it's just massive in scope, and you have the Avengers, and you have, Excalibur, and you have Alpha Flight, and you have, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and the X-Men and so on and so forth. The Ultimate Universe was designed to be far more contained and much, much smaller in scale. And so the result is that when it came to the Ultimate Spider-Man stories by Brian Michael Bendis, the idea was to basically keep things relatively small, to tell these small volumes where characters would appear and then never be seen or heard from again, or else if they were seen, they were just in a containment cell or they were being held by S.H.I.E.L.D. or something along those lines. But it was very easy to digest and it was very, very easy to follow. And that's one of the reasons why the Ultimate Universe was relatively popular, but in the end, people still gravitated toward the characters that they thought of when they thought of Captain America, when they thought of Thor, and so on and so forth. Now, with regards to Miles Morales, Peter Parker was basically the recipient of a bite from a spider that contained the Oz formula. And again, the whole idea here in the Ultimate Universe was that Nick Fury, I guess Samuel Jackson Nick Fury if you want to call him that, Nick Fury was the original super soldier. And when the super soldier serum that was used on Nick Fury proved to be successful, it resulted in this great gold rush, more or less, for everybody to create their own super soldiers. And so that's where Wolverine came from. Wolverine was the recipient of Canada's attempt to create a super soldier serum, but along the way, they discovered a mutant gene that when activated would give people powers. And that was the origin of the mutant race in the Ultimate Universe. When it came to Spider-Man, you had a guy, Norman Osborn, who was basically trying to create a super soldier serum. And he created something called the Oz formula, and where he was going through and testing it on different spiders. One of these spiders bit Peter Parker, which led him to become Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe. But following the course of his publication history, somewhere around 160 issues or so, which this is far shorter than that. I think Miles Morales' stories probably total in like maybe 30 or 40 issues. It's not really that long at all. But following the publication history of Peter Parker, he eventually died. And the reason was because Marvel was wanting to basically make way for a new Spider-Man. And that just made good sense. You had Ultimate Spider-Man Peter Parker, and then you had the main Marvel Universe Peter Parker. Why have two versions of the same character? Give us a new Spider-Man. And so that's what they did. They killed off Peter Parker, and they had a spider basically bite a new kid by the name of Miles Morales, who gained Peter Parker's powers, and then a couple of his own that Peter didn't have. For example, Miles Morales can administer this venom shock, which is basically kind of like an electrical impulse that basically shocks a person that's touching him or something along those lines. He can make himself invisible, he can camouflage himself, that kind of a thing. And so again, Miles was very much his own character, but the whole idea here, and really where the story begins to pick up, is we start to get into his uncle, Aaron Davis. Now, the crazy thing about Aaron Davis's character is that as interesting as he is, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye. It's not as clean cut as him just being a con man, but that's how he comes off. He comes off as a con artist, he comes off as a thief and a cheat, but he's actually a very capable guy. And the way this story unfolds is it's actually going to be a sort of a battle of allegiances, so to speak, for Miles Morales himself. But what ends up happening here is we actually pick up with Aaron Davis traveling back, or at least intending to meet the Tinkerer. Now, the Tinkerer is basically a character who creates devices. I mean, really, the Tinkerer was who we saw in the Spider-Man Homecoming movie that was working alongside Michael Keaton. The other half of this is that it also deals with the introduction of a new version of the Scorpion. And the reason why I say new version is because of the fact that in the Peter Parker Ultimate Spider-Man line of comics, in those stories, the Scorpion was introduced, but he was actually introduced as a clone of Peter Parker. The issue with this was that with Brian Michael Bendis writing the story at the time and wanting to create a new Spider-Man, it also made sense to give this new Spider-Man, Miles Morales, his own villains to face off against. And so what ended up happening is the Scorpion, as he appeared in the original Peter Parker stories in the Ultimate Universe, he was basically defeated, he was revealed to be a clone of Peter Parker, and then he was just never really seen or heard from again after he was taken captive by S.H.I.E.L.D. That was really it. This version of Scorpion seems to be more in line with the Scorpion that we saw from Spider-Man Homecoming. This Scorpion seems to be more grounded in terms of who he is and what he's about and that kind of a thing. His backstory still remains pretty ambiguous, and it will for a little while, but suffice it to say, he's basically in New York because of the fact that Prowler owes him cash, and that's really about it. Now, the other half of this is Miles Morales trying to make his way and trying to figure out how to be a superhero. But the other thing to focus on here is that Miles is struggling with the exact same thing that Peter Parker did. And that's one of the cool things about this, is that what Bendis and them are basically saying is that no matter what universe we're in, for the most part, unless the character is drastically different from who we're used to, he's always going to struggle with the same thing. Should he tell his friends and family who he is? And if he does, what are the consequences of that? Because remember, if he were to tell his mom, for example, that he's Spider-Man, she may believe him, she may not believe him. But if she has that knowledge, it makes her a target for somebody else. And so she basically can't spill the beans on something she doesn't know anything about. And if Miles never tells her, then nobody has any reason to go after her. They have no reason to connect the two people. Now, something else to focus on is that, again, when Bendis and them created Miles Morales, they didn't just abandon the concept of Peter Parker in his entirety. I mean, he's dead, he doesn't show up, and he won't show up again until Spider-Man. But the idea here was to keep the legacy of Peter Parker going. Genki really just kind of goes to Miles and says, look, it's cool that you're Spider-Man, but you don't really know what you're doing. And Peter Parker's not here to teach you what you need to know because he's dead. And so you need to be able to learn what Peter Parker knew from Peter Parker himself the best way you know how, which is to basically watch movies of Peter Parker fighting. And that's kind of the cool thing because, you know, Miles gets a video, gets to watch footage of the Ultimate Universe Peter Parker facing off against Dr. Octopus, nothing too significant, but his first real attempt in trying to stand toe-to-toe and trying to really become Spider-Man comes with the arrival of a character by the name of Omega Red. Now, Omega Red in the Ultimate Universe was starkly different from his character in the main Marvel Universe. In the main Marvel Universe, Omega Red was the byproduct of the Russians trying to duplicate Wolverine. That's really all it was. It was the idea that Wolverine had been taken by the Weapon X project, his healing factor had been used in order to bond his body with adamantium, and the result was that he ended up going forward as just this adamantium-laced killing machine. The Russians tried to duplicate the same process, but the difference here is that the Russians didn't know the formula for adamantium, and so because of that, they ended up creating a cheap knockoff called carbonadium. Now, carbonadium's still pretty durable, and it's still pretty potent in terms of what it's capable of, but naturally, this eventually led to a battle of sorts between Omega Red and Wolverine, with the two of them becoming mortal enemies. In the Ultimate Universe, it was starkly different. Omega Red was basically just a guy who was a mutant. He gained these powers that allowed him to just kind of expand these organic tendrils from his body. He could emit toxins, different things like that, but he wasn't nearly as capable as his main Marvel counterpart. But the reason why this is important is because of the fact that for Miles Morales, going against somebody like Omega Red is going against someone he's never experienced before. And so it's really him kind of on the edge of his seat, using his powers as best he can, trying to become a legitimate hero, because with trying to dodge these tendrils and so on, it requires him to use basically every ounce of agility he has. As we would expect, he comes out on top. But the idea of Aaron Davis being rolled in as part of Miles Morales' Spider-Man story comes when, again, Aaron Davis basically encounters the Tinkerer. And it's the idea that the Tinkerer, you know, when Aaron Davis is looking at this newspaper about a new Spider-Man and so on and so forth, the Tinkerer basically gives Aaron Davis the whole backstory of how Spider-Man became Spider-Man. The original Peter Parker became Spider-Man. Of course, as we talked about, Norman Osborn created the the Oz formula, so on and so forth. But this also rings a bell for the Prowler, because remember, in our video on the origin of Miles Morales, he was bitten by a spider in front of Uncle Aaron Davis. And the result was that Aaron Davis saw the spider and saw a number on it. And so because of that, when, Tinkerer begins to explain all these things about what Osborn was doing, how he would perform experiments on these spiders, he would number them and he would catalog them in order to keep track of what his experiments were doing and how they were progressing. Aaron Davis comes to the realization that a numbered spider bit his nephew, and then suddenly there's this new Spider-Man on the scene. Two and two together, Miles Morales is Spider-Man. And that's why I say that Prowler, Aaron Davis, is actually sharper than people give him credit for. I mean, he's smarter than your average bear, I guess. But it's kind of a cool thing because it sets the stage for this idea of Aaron Davis being brought in, asking for some pretty nefarious things. And that's really the first thing that he does. I mean, as soon as he realizes that Miles is Spider-Man, he goes to him and says, hey man, like we should work together. Like we can put our efforts together and we can really achieve something great. Now, remember, Miles was informed by his father that his uncle Aaron was a con artist and a crook and served time in jail. Miles' father was heading down the same path. And so Miles' father had basically warned him, hey, look, do not get in the mix with your uncle Aaron. The other half of this is that Miles' father, I wouldn't go as far as to say is a very cautious man, so much as he's trying to ensure his son stays safe, but he's also a little overprotective. And this is where the whole element of loyalties begins to come into play. Because with Miles Morales, he's kind of stuck in two different situations. The first is that he believes in his father. I mean, it's his dad. He follows his father as best he can, but it almost feels like his father's trying to shelter him from the world's experiences. And life in and of itself, people growing and becoming something better than they are, is all about experiences, doing something stupid and learning from that experience. At the same time, it's his uncle Aaron Davis, and he knows that he's a crook, but if he wants to go out and experience life, there's a lot of different ways to do that, but family is family, blood is blood. And so again, that's one of the interesting things about this story, and that's one of the reasons why I've loved Miles Morales' character for so long, is because it's just the inner struggle between the two of them. Now, with regards to Aaron Davis having killed the Tinkerer so that nobody would know about the possibility of Miles Morales being Ultimate Spider-Man, it also comes into play with him, I guess, re-encountering Scorpion again. And this is when we basically learn that Scorpion was owed money by Aaron Davis, that presumably Aaron Davis essentially cheated him out of cash. Scorpion comes back looking for his money. Now, the other half of this is that we also get some perspective in terms of what Scorpion's capable of. And what we're actually informed here is that he's not just some crazy guy, who is a mob boss out of Mexico. Instead, he does have some abilities. And one of the most notable is a highly resistant skin. Aaron Davis ultimately just ends up fleeing for his life when he begins to realize just how capable Scorpion is, and that he's not really a pushover. Now, of course, this leads to exactly what we would expect it to, in the sense that Aaron Davis essentially flees to his nephew, Miles Morales. And this is probably one of the best elements of the story. And the reason for this is because Aaron Davis approaching his nephew is done from ill intent. Like, it's him showing up and essentially having this ulterior motive. There's a guy trying to kill me, I want to try to take him out, so on and so forth. But he doesn't say that. He doesn't go to Miles Morales and say, hey man, I did something really bad. I screwed a guy over in Mexico and he got here to New York and he's trying to kill me. You got to help me take this guy out. That's not what he says. Instead, what he does is he pawns it off on the idea of being a tutor of sorts. And that's kind of the cool thing, because Aaron Davis uses, basically the abilities of his suit combined with his own experiences to engage Miles in hand-to-hand combat. And this is why I say, sometimes, despite the fact that there can be nefarious purposes here, at the end of the day, there is still something to be learned. And so while Aaron Davis is trying to manipulate his own nephew, Aaron Davis is teaching Miles how to become a more effective fighter. Because remember, Miles doesn't have any martial arts training. He doesn't have military training. He has no kind of training at all. He's a kid who was bitten by a radioactive spider and then suddenly has all these powers. And so he doesn't know how to fight. He doesn't have any of that kind of training stuff. He's really just flying by the seat of his pants every step of the way in every single conflict he gets into. Now, the other half is to remember, he learns as he goes through. And that's kind of the cool thing, is because he's literally learning to fight while he's fighting. And so that's one of the crazy things about his character and his evolution. But the idea of Aaron Davis is saying, look, I'm trying to help you out here. Now, Aaron is not totally evil. Like, he's not a total bad guy. He's not just like, I don't care whether you live or die. I'm just trying to make sure that this guy Scorpion gets off my back. Instead, it's really this idea that he's going to him and he's saying, look, I don't want to see you killed. And that really is one of the reasons why Aaron Davis's character is so intricate and is so complex, is because on one half, he's a thief, he's a con artist, he's a manipulator, but at the other half, that's family. That's his nephew. The last Spider-Man was killed by his own enemies. It'd be a lot easier for Miles Morales to be killed by different foes because he doesn't have nearly the experience or the training that Peter Parker had. And so again, it's kind of a cool scenario scenario. Now, of course, ultimately Miles is able to overcome Aaron Davis to the point that he proves that he's able to hold his own to a degree. And this is where the conversation begins to unfold, is because Aaron Davis basically says, I want to train you. I want to make you a good fighter. I want to turn you into somebody who can be a legitimate superhero. And this is why it's kind of this idea that these two characters have conflicting sides where, you know, Aaron Davis is just kind of a small-time crook and a con man, and Miles Morales is trying to be a good guy. At the end of the day, they have a common goal, and the common goal is to take out an even worse bad guy named Scorpion. And so that's the common ground that the two of them reside on at this moment. It allows the characters to sort of progress and to grow and so on and so forth. And so where we ultimately have Miles just kind of cruising the internet and trying to learn about this Scorpion character, and we eventually have him just sort of mulling this entire situation over, and then ultimately agreeing to side with his uncle Aaron against the wishes of his parents after learning that this guy Scorpion has engaged in acts of racketeering, murder, theft, violating other human beings. This guy is just a genuinely terrible human being. And so because of that, you know, ultimately Miles ends up siding with his uncle, which again sets the stage for some pretty cool stuff. But okay, so we are a couple weeks out from the release of the PlayStation 5 and Miles Morales Spider-Man. Spider-Man Miles Morales, I guess is what they're calling it, whatever it is, the Spider-Man 2 game. And here's the thing, okay, I'm actually kind of sad about this. Myself and Mariah have not pre-ordered, like we didn't get a chance to pre-order the PS5, right? Like the pre-orders were out like that, like it was insane. So here's the deal. Are there any members of the Rob Corps in Columbus, Ohio that can hook up myself and Mariah with PlayStation 5? Right, I'll give you like an extra $200 plus the cost of the PlayStation 5s if you can hook us up. That would be awesome, right? That'd be super cool. If you can, send me an email, rob@comicsexplained.com. That would be amazing. I don't know if any of you guys can. We'll even go as far as Cleveland if we have to, but that'd be awesome if you guys could, right? So it's been a little while since we covered Miles Morales, right? We covered the first two, and I think we did it like 3 years ago. So we're gonna do a little bit of catch up here for people who are really uncertain and who are kind of lagging behind in the midst of all this. So Miles Morales becoming Spider-Man came out of what was basically like Cataclysm to a degree, right? It was basically this great big huge story arc in the Ultimate Universe where that version of Spider-Man had died, right? So a little bit of explanation here. The Ultimate Universe was launched in 2000, and it was the answer to the question, what would it look like if superheroes existed in the real world, right? A more modern depiction of superheroes as we know them in Marvel Comics. The Ultimate Universe was hugely popular, and it was basically launched with Ultimate Spider-Man, right? With Peter Parker. Now, when Peter Parker died, Spider-Man fans were pissed, right? They were so mad because they loved that version of Spider-Man. And as we know, as comic book fans, we don't really like it when things change, right? We like things to stay the same forever and ever and ever, because when things are different, it takes us getting used to it again, and we just don't want to have to go through all that. You know, we're old people, right? We just get stuck in our ways. And the result of this is that when Miles Morales initially came onto the scene, there was a lot of hate for the character of Miles. The funny thing is, he's hugely popular now. So much so that, like, one, he's got his own game, and two, I've heard nothing but people being excited about the new Miles Morales game, right? So as with most things in comics, give it time and you may end up finding that you like it. But the whole thing behind this is that in the early days and kind of in the beginning of this, Miles Morales, having been bitten by a spider that gave him radioactive powers in much the same way that Peter Parker did, was met with a lot of backlash in the Ultimate Comics universe, right? Like in the actual comics themselves, because Peter Parker had like just died. And then Miles, you know, in order to honor the memory of Peter, went out and got a Spider-Man suit and then was like, okay, let's be Spider-Man, right? And he was met by like Nick Fury, he was met by Jessica Drew, or whatever you want to call her, basically the Ultimate Universe version of Spider-Girl, Spider-Woman, and they were kind of like, you can't do this, right? Like you're disrespecting the memory of Peter. But the reality was that Miles believed that he was honoring the memory of Peter, right? Like he believed he was doing the right thing. And so ultimately he ended up getting the blessing of Nick Fury, and then this led to the introduction of the Prowler, right? And the Prowler was a character who had already been around, and the Prowler was basically the uncle of Miles Morales. He was basically Aaron, right? And the idea behind this was that you ended up having Miles basically allying himself with Aaron as part of Aaron's request. Now, when Miles started realizing that things were a little sketchy here, that's when all this kind of started popping off, right? But this really is kind of like when the two of them first start teaming up. We as the reader knew that Aaron was a bad guy, right? Like we knew he was basically a villain. He was one of the most wanted men in the United States, and in fact, he was wanted by Interpol and the FBI, right? Like it was a huge deal. Again, it's probably one of the best thieves, if not the best thief in the entirety of the Ultimate Universe. He was kind of a big deal. Now, with him and Miles teaming up for the first time, This involves them going after a guy by the name of Scorpion. In Marvel, in the Ultimate Universe, you had two versions of the Scorpion character, and you're probably familiar with him from like maybe Spider-Man, the animated series back in the 90s, or comic books, or whatever the case is. But the Scorpion that you initially saw in Ultimate Comics was part of the Ultimate Universe line of the Clone Saga, right? Like cloning Peter Parker. That's where, you know, the Jessica character came from and so on. But the Scorpion was a clone of Peter Parker, right? So that was kind of like that version that we saw. I wouldn't go as far as to say he was hugely popular. I honestly didn't really enjoy the whole concept, but the thing about this is that this version of Scorpion that we see here is the guy who's actually named Maximus Gargan, right? So his name is almost identical to the one from the main Marvel Universe, Max Gargan. The difference here is that unlike Mac Gargan in the main Marvel Universe, who's just a guy who's a criminal, in the Ultimate Universe, Maximus Gargan was basically a Mexican crime lord, is essentially what he was. He was like a Mexican drug kingpin, but he was working for Prowler. And so essentially you had this kind of exchange that was supposed to go on between the two of them. But basically Maximus Gargan ended up turning on the Prowler. It led into a great big huge fight. Prowler basically got out of there. And then Maximus has come here to New York City in order to make himself a kingpin. And because of the fact that he was able to overcome Prowler before, the indication is he can do it again, right? So he's not too worried about the Prowler's character. But that's why they're here, is because Aaron is trying to get rid of Maximus, or trying to get rid of Scorpion, because Scorpion's encroaching on his turf. The idea that he's pitching to Miles Morales is he's a bad guy, right? So we got to get rid of bad guys. So he's essentially using Miles' desire to be a hero in order to effectively turn Miles into his own enforcer, is really kind of what's happening here. But Scorpion showing up here and just being like, okay, so like, you know, this is my spot now, right? Like I'm taking over this. Like I was a guy who operated in Mexico, that's true, but like now I want to swim with the bigger fish, right? And so I'm taking the entirety of New York over. I'm going to become its new kingpin. The funny thing about this is that he's immediately met by Aaron, right? He's immediately met by the Prowler, and in turn the Prowler's like, okay, so like you gotta go, right? You gotta go. Now the response of Scorpion is like, you still owe me payment, right? Like you still owe me for our last deal that went down. Technically that's true. That when that deal initially went down, that Aaron was the one who refused to live up to his end of the bargain. Now he did so under the auspices that Scorpion tried to double cross him, right? And saying like, you forfeited your share of this whole thing when you tried to double cross me, but technically a deal is a deal. And so the result of this is that, you know, Scorpion's here to kind of call in his end and take out the Prowler if he can, and then take over New York himself. Now, of course, this leads to Spider-Man jumping in. Now, there are questions that you're most likely asking here, right? Where are characters like Daredevil or like Luke Cage or Heroes for Hire or any of the number of ground level heroes that we see in New York that could easily respond to a threat like this? The reality of the Ultimate Universe, guys, is that it was designed to be a far more stripped down version of the main Marvel Universe. The main Marvel Universe, just to give you perspective, had like thousands of mutants who had appeared over the course of Marvel's publication history, and those are the ones that they focused on for any real measure of time. When you take into account the one-offs, the ones who appeared for like a single story, then you're starting to get into the hundreds of thousands, right? There were just, you know, so many different mutants that had appeared. And so you take that and you expand it to like the almost never-ending roster of Avengers. You add in things like the Midnight Suns, right? You add in like, you know, Doctor Strange's Black Ops Defenders team from like the 1990s, right? They carried out like all these secret missions and things like that. It was super cool. It was an awesome concept. It was terribly executed, but it was an awesome concept. But you take all these things and you throwing it in, and what you end up in the main Marvel Universe, you end up with this just hugely expansive landscape of heroes, and it's insanely difficult to keep up with it all. The Ultimate Universe wanted to correct that, right? So you have like the Ultimates, you've got the Fantastic Four, you've got the X-Men, you got Spider-Man, and that's basically it, right? You see other characters kind of pop in and out, but you weren't really seeing like Ultimate Comics Blade, right? You weren't really seeing that. You weren't really seeing like Ultimate Comics Werewolf by Night. You weren't really seeing any of that stuff, right? Any of like these characters that would have been interesting to see. Instead, it was designed to be super closed down. I would say that overall, in terms of individual publications, right? Individual comic book lines, I think you may be capped out at 20 comics over the course of the Ultimate Universe's lifespan. And I'd say that's probably about it, if that, right? It was very, 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 very small. Seeing other characters would happen in other characters' comics, things like that, right? So just one of the, you know, kind of an answer to that question, you know, why don't we see a lot more going on here? Because it's not designed to be overly huge, right? It's one of the great things about the Ultimate Universe. But of course, this is when things pop off. Basically, you know, everybody pulls guns blazing, shots firing, everything's going all to pieces. Now, this is when we kind of get reminded a little bit of the Scorpion's powers, right? And make sure you guys check down in the description, just kind of a reminder, make sure you check down in the description. You'll find Ultimate Spider-Man, really the first two videos that we did, volumes 1 and 2. You'll find that down there so you can get caught up and you won't feel like you're just kind of flying in out of nowhere. But the idea behind Scorpion is that he has enhanced durability and enhanced strength. Now, he's not completely invulnerable, and he doesn't have like super superhuman strength, right? Where he's like equal to the Incredible Hulk in strength or anything like that. He's just kind of got enhanced abilities, but they're enough to where he can easily hold his own against, like, you know, being shot at or being stabbed or something along those lines, right? So he doesn't really have Luke Cage's skin, but something reasonably close to it. The other part of this is that given his enhanced abilities, he also is able to go toe-to-toe with Miles Morales. But the reason why this happens is because Miles is still learning about his powers, right? He's still learning what he's capable of. Now, a lot of Miles' ability to expand beyond his existing horizons will actually come in the first Spider-Man story, which we will cover. That's basically, it was really cool. It was when Bendis basically told all the Miles Morales haters to shut up when they were like, he's not really Spider-Man. Bendis literally wrote a story where Peter Parker from the main Marvel universe and Miles Morales from the Ultimate Universe, and Peter Parker's like, who cares what the world says? I think you're a great Spider-Man, go forward, right? And it's basically Bendis saying, hey, I know you guys, some of you guys out there don't like Miles Morales, tough luck. And then just like continuing to write the story. It was amazing. It was a hilarious response to the haters. But the funny thing about this is that Miles is learning his powers. And so when it comes to somebody like Peter, right, if we look at like even the Ultimate Universe comics version of Spider-Man Peter Parker, or you look at the main Marvel Universe version of Spider-Man Peter Parker, the important thing is that in the early days, he had his learning, he had his process where he learned his powers, but as time went on, it started to become second nature to where he could just react and instinctively know what he needs to do. You know, that's one of the things that kind of came out of Dan Slott's run, is when he was talking about why Spider-Man would crack jokes all the time. Because where you kind of looked at it and saw Spider-Man as almost kind of a nonsensical character, you know, when he was engaging in fights and didn't really seem to be taking it seriously, the reason why he would crack jokes is because he wanted to make the villains think he wasn't taking them seriously, and that in turn would piss them off. And the angrier they got, the less focused they became, and the easier it would be for Peter Parker to take them out. That's one of the things that he kind of learned over the course of his time as Spider-Man. With Miles Morales, it'll be much the same way. That as we cover these comics, you'll quite literally see Miles become better at being Spider-Man. But in these early comics here, in this third volume of his original run, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't really have any official training. And that's really what he was told by Nick Fury. When Nick Fury sanctioned him as being Spider-Man, he's like, you're on your own to figure out how to be a superhero. We're not going to train you, right? We're not going to give you like official training, at least not at the moment. We're not going to do any of that, right? Like, you just got to become the best version of Spider-Man that you can on your own. And if you really are meant to be a great Spider-Man, then you will become one. If not, then you'll probably suck and you'll probably end up getting killed. Best of luck. And that was basically it. It was kind of a dick move. But, you know, ultimately, one of the things that Miles ends up doing is underestimating Scorpion, right? In the sense that he's able to overcome him for a minute. And where Aaron wants to get his revenge on Scorpion, the response of Miles is, no, it's one thing to stop a criminal, it's another to go out of your way and try to kill the guy, right? Like, that's not going to do anybody any good. And ultimately, Miles ends up intending to kind of walk away. Now, Scorpion wakes up, Scorpion attacks Miles goes invisible, he attacks Scorpion again, and then when Miles turns his back, Scorpion gets away. And so it's one of these things where he's constantly underestimating the villains that he faces off against. But that's because he simply hasn't learned that you have to make sure that they're knocked out, right? Like, you know, that's one of the things that Peter kind of learned, right, as time went on, that like as he would face off against different villains, he would realize just because they look like they're knocked out doesn't mean they are, right? You gotta pummel them a few extra times, right? You gotta, you know, smack them around a little bit more than you normally would, and then, you know, then they'll be knocked out, and that'll basically be it. You know, you gotta slap them around a bit is kind of what Peter Parker would do. But of course, this leads to of course, you know, Miles Morales tracking down Scorpion, going to attack him again, and then using his Venom Blast, right, to essentially incapacitate him. This kind of Venom Shock ability that he has to incapacitate Scorpion, and then handing Scorpion over to the cops. Now, the response to the police officers is to initially try to arrest Miles Morales, and that is the way his comics were in the early days, right? And it wasn't really like a racial thing. It wasn't like he's wearing a black Spider-Man costume, obviously he's black, get him. It wasn't necessarily like that. It was this idea that they didn't know him. Like when Peter Parker first showed up on the scene, in a lot of ways it was kind of a welcoming thing. Now, a lot of that was because of the fact that it was Spider-Man, right? And nobody wants to really read comics where the world hates Spider-Man. And then two, because it was kind of the launch of the Ultimate Universe, right? So it was designed to be kind of a celebratory run, you know, this kind of celebratory inaugural run in Peter. Now, he did run into a whole bunch of problems, and there were times when society was kind of like, you know, but nonetheless, you know, with Miles Morales, in a lot of ways, the writing, how the cops are depicted here is designed to kind of depict the naysayers, right? In the sense that he's not Spider-Man, we don't really know what's going on here, but get rid of him. You know, he's not legit. And so as a result of that, of course, he makes himself invisible and ends up taking off, right? Ends up, you know, kind of going back to where Aaron and them were looking to find Aaron, and Aaron basically disappeared. Now, the next day, you end up getting Miles Miles meeting up with Genki, right? Meeting up with Genki Lee. The two of them kind of talking, you know, and he's like, dude, you busted like Maximus, right? You busted the Scorpion, like he's this huge thing. And then that's when he starts talking to his Uncle Aaron. And his Uncle Aaron's like, he's like, where'd you go? He's like, I'm gonna go get some rest. Are you okay? And you know, it's like, okay, like we're just getting started, right? Like we're gonna get back to this again. And Miles' initial idea is no, like I don't want to be involved in this, right? And that's when Aaron kind of breaks out that blackmail card in the sense of like, I wanted like, then maybe I should hit up your dad, right? Maybe I should tell your dad what's going on. Now, that's a little bit of backstory that we haven't really explained yet. The idea was that Aaron, of course, has kind of always been a criminal his whole life. It started out with him just kind of getting into mischief when he was younger, and then graduating into, you know, more intense and more, not really violent, but more serious crimes. The father of Miles was involved in that to a degree, but eventually went his own separate way, right? He kind of went, you know, basically went on the right path, kind of corrected himself and got himself into a better place. The result of this is that the father of Miles does not like Aaron, and he does not want Aaron to have any involvement in Miles' life, and he's made that clear to Miles, right? Like, do not spend time with your uncle. He's a bad guy, right? Like, he's a criminal. Like, if you follow him, like, he will get you into trouble. He doesn't care about anybody. He doesn't care about anything. If he leads you to believe that he cares about you, it's because he's duping you, right? Like, he's using you for his own ends. And so that's one of the things that kind of went on here, is that Miles knew he wasn't really supposed to be spending time with Aaron, but he has been anyway. The other part of this is that Miles' parents don't know anything about his powers, right? They don't know that he's Spider-Man. And so he's kind of trying to keep this secret from them. Now, it's one of these things where Aaron knows this and then uses it against him and says, well, I mean, we can go in there right now, right? When Miles meets him later on, he's like, we can go in there right now and I can just tell them everything that's going on. Miles' response is, no, fine, like I'll meet with you the same place as last time. And so when the two of them end up meeting up together, Miles shows up and says, this is not gonna happen. He's like, I'll tell my parents if I need to, but here's what's gonna go on. You're gonna leave town, right? Like you are really a bad person. You're every bit as bad as my dad said you were, right? Like you really don't care about anybody but yourself. Like you don't come near me, you don't come near my parents, right? Now, this was important for Miles. This was a hugely important moment for Miles Morales. And the reason why is because for his character, the way he was originally written, he wasn't necessarily a people pleaser, but he had this desire to connect with his Uncle Aaron. And the fact that he was able to connect to a degree, even when he was younger and he spent time with him, knowing that he wasn't necessarily supposed to, you know, in this moment right now, spending time with his Uncle Aaron and trying to get to know him on a more personal level is compounded and made difficult by the fact that Aaron really is a bad guy. And so coming to him with Miles Morales being largely a character who lacked a lot of confidence in himself, right? Who lacked confidence in himself, what he was capable of and what he could achieve, to in turn come along and to go against somebody like the Prowler, who, despite not having the powers of Spider-Man, is wildly capable of going toe to toe with one. He's basically saying like, you're gonna leave here, right? Like you're gonna leave this town. You're never gonna talk to me or my parents again, you know. And it's one of these things where Prowler's like, fine, like if you want to play with the big boys, then you got to be ready. And then he in turn attacks Miles Morales. And this is not easy fight for Miles, right? Using a combination of all of his gadgetry, his sonics, all those things at his disposal, he's able to kind of get the upper hand on Miles. But one of the important things here is that Miles starts to gain more confidence in his abilities and begins to use his powers in the way that he's supposed to, right? Making himself invisible, using sneak attack, using subtlety, different things like that. And that's one of the important things to understand, is that when it comes to someone like Miles, what he lacks in experience, he makes up for in powers that Peter Parker simply just didn't have. Peter Parker did not have a Venom Blast. He could not make himself invisible, right? And so, you know, with Miles, the fact that he's still learning how to fight, this actually bends itself to his favor, right? Instead of being something that can just enhance his existing abilities, it can help him compensate for his lack of experience, right? Making himself invisible and then coming back around again. And so he's able to kind of get the upper hand on Aaron and actually ends up damaging one of his gloves, right? One of his power gloves. And when that happens, of course, the fight ends up leading down into the street, where basically there's almost like this massive wreck or this city bus, you know, kind of topples over when Aaron ends up blasting it, right, with his gloves. And that's really when Miles begins to get the bigger picture that Aaron really doesn't care about anybody but himself, that he really is a tried and true villain. And this is also significant because one of the biggest issues that Miles had is he had this desire to inherently see the good in everybody. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, that kind of naivety can really cause you problems later on down the line, right? The belief that people are inherently good, and if they end up doing bad things, it's because they were in a rough spot, but they want to become good people. That can cost lives. And that's what Miles is learning here, that Aaron isn't a guy who was just down on his luck and ended up in a bad spot and there's a way to reach him and turn him back into a good guy. He's just a bad person. And the fact that he's willing to like endanger the lives of a busload of people in order to get the upper hand in a fight against Miles Morales really shows the kind of person that he is. And so at that point, Miles Morales starts cutting loose, right? He starts letting loose, and it's just like, fine. Like if that's how we're gonna fight, then let's fight. This is gonna be a knockdown, drag out fight. He uses his Venom Blast, starts literally hitting Aaron from every direction and getting the upper hand. The problem with this is that in a split second, Aaron gets the upper hand on Miles and goes to attack him and seemingly does it with the intention of killing him. The problem with this is the previous attack by Miles that damaged his glove ends up coming home to roost when the whole thing explodes, right? It's like a bomb going off. And when that happens, it kills Aaron, right? It looks like it kills Aaron. And so it's just kind of like the last little word that Miles gets here from Aaron is like, look at that, right? You're just like me. You don't care who you kill as long as you come out on top. It's just this crushing response to Miles effectively getting his uncle killed, or seemingly getting his uncle killed. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with Ultimate Spider-Man Venom War, i.e. the story where Miles Morales fights Venom. And the ending of the story is amazing, so I'm really excited to see how you guys respond to this. But what this does is this initially opens up with Miles Morales and his family enjoying dinner together. But when there's a knock on the door and Jefferson Davis, the father of Miles, answers it, reporters come barging in and then asking him whether or not he's like the new Spider-Man. Is it true he overpowered Hydra? All that kind of stuff. Now, the reason why they're asking Jefferson Davis these questions is twofold. The first has to do with a reporter named Betty Brant, and the second has to do with Jefferson Davis' own history. So, focusing on Betty Brant here for a second, the way this played out is Betty Brant, being a reporter working at the Daily Bugle, she had uncovered what she believed to be the true identity of the current Spider-Man running around that basically replaced Peter Parker after Peter died in the Ultimate Universe. And she believed that person to be Jefferson Davis. Now, a lot of that was just based on Jefferson's own history, along with her just kind of putting pieces together and maybe cooking the books a little bit. And the reason why I say that is because Jefferson is incredibly accomplished in the sense that there was one point where he was captured by Hydra, he overpowered them and then executed a whole bunch of Hydra soldiers. There was a point where he became a spy for S.H.I.E.L.D., working for Nick Fury, and spied on a guy named Turk, who was a criminal warlord. So the guy's got the kind of chops that you would expect from a person who would be a Spider-Man. But the fact that Miles lives in the same home as Jefferson gave Betty Brant the belief that Jefferson was Spider-Man, because while Miles is running out and doing all the Spider-Man stuff, his base of operations is in that general area. So again, it was really more Betty Brant trying to put the pieces together. Now, of course, Jefferson Davis gets 8 kinds of pissed off when reporters barge into his house and start asking him questions. And so once he forces all of them out, he ends up leaving, right? He ends up going for a walk. And in that moment, he's immediately set upon by the Venom symbiote who's been hunting for Spider-Man. Now, here's one of the things we need to explain here. The Venom symbiote in the Ultimate Universe is not the same as the Venom symbiote in the main Marvel Universe. In Earth 616 in Marvel Comics, the main Marvel Universe, the Venom symbiote is an alien that was created by a guy called Null. In the Ultimate Universe, the Venom symbiote is actually a biosuit. It was an attempt to create a kind of healing suit that could basically heal anybody from virtually any injuries they sustain. The grand idea was to use it for military applications, bond it to soldiers, send them into the field, that kind of a thing. But as time progressed, and when you had the original War of the Symbiotes, with Eddie Brock Jr. being the original host for Venom, that initially it was believed the Venom suit was destroyed. Now, little bits of the Venom suit survived, and it's been taken by different people over the years. In this instance, the version of Venom that we see here is actually owned and operated by Roxxon Industries, but we'll talk about them here in a second. The important takeaway from this is that when the Venom suit shows up, of course, Miles Morales responds exactly the way that you would expect him to. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here is that Miles is still figuring out how to be Spider-Man. And the reason why this matters is because with Venom going after Jefferson and Miles responding, if this was Peter Parker, he would have lured Venom to a location where there were no bystanders, there were no innocents. Instead, Miles is fighting out of desperation, the desire to keep his father safe and to keep different civilians around here protected. But that lack of experience comes to bear in the sense that he's almost immediately overwhelmed by Venom. And the fight is amazing. I mean, dude, Venom absolutely pummels this guy. When it comes to Spider-Man facing off against villains, right, Peter Parker, or really any Spider-Man, just kind of jokes and does all kinds of little cracky things and so on and so forth. But through it all, Peter very rarely ever loses the upper hand, right? Miles Morales ain't that way. And so while Miles is getting thrown around like a rag doll, I mean, just getting absolutely crushed by Venom, then in turn, like, these cops show up and start opening fire. So then Venom turns his attention to the cops and starts to help them fend finished with all of their living. Now, of course, Miles jumps in, and starts attacking the Venom symbiote yet again. Now, one of the things that I will give Miles here, right? I gotta give Miles credit for this. This kid's fighting with every ounce of strength that he has, and he's doing his best, right? I don't mean to discredit him and be like, Miles, you are a trash Spider-Man. He's doing his best. Now, one of the things that I also want to point out here is that Miles is aware of Venom to a degree, and it's only because of the fact that he saw YouTube videos where Peter Parker Spider-Man had fought Venom. So that's the only reason why he's even aware of the idea of like Venom's weaknesses. But what he ends up doing is using his Venom Blast on Venom, and when that happens, literally the Venom symbiote just kind of succumbs to it and just sort of explodes. Not really like blowing up all over the place, but it kind of scrambles the nature of the symbiote and ends up sending the symbiote running. And so following that, Jefferson Davis is taken to the hospital. Now, what follows next is morally questionable at best, and just downright diabolical at worst, but we'll talk about that here in a second. What we actually end up doing here is Miles gets information, because one of the things to remember is that Miles has never actually faced off against Venom, and he doesn't even know why Venom's coming after him in the first place, or why he even went after Jefferson Davis. And so what you end up having is Miles and his friend Genki meeting with Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson. Now, these two are incredibly important in relation to this part of the story, and the reason why is because Gwen Stacy was caught up in the original War of the Symbiotes. And when I say that, I mean, she was basically killed by the original Eddie Brock Jr. Venom, right? The original host for the Venom symbiote. And she was in fact absorbed into it, which was kind of a crazy thing, because as this conversation unfolds, what they say here is that Venom has a deep-rooted DNA genetic connection to the Parker bloodline. Now, the reason for this is because of the fact that the Venom symbiote was in one part created by Peter Parker's dad in the Ultimate Universe. He was one half of the creation team that led to Venom coming into existence. And so what she says is it was originally created from Peter's father's DNA, and it had literally stalked and hunted Peter once he, or Venom, or it, whatever you want to call it, realized who Peter was. Now with Peter gone, it may just be looking for you because, like him, you became Spider-Man. So whatever was special about Peter Parker genetically, you might have the same thing. And so the reason why this matters is that with like Betty Brant dead and Peter Parker dead, no one really knows why the Venom symbiote is doing what it's doing right now. It feeds on energy and life force, so the best estimation we can get is that it's just kind of driven by a desire to absorb whoever Spider-Man is and then expand its own abilities based on the powers of that Spider-Man. But having said that, when I mentioned that what happened next was just morally questionable at best and just diabolical at worst, the Venom symbiote breaks into a hospital. It literally attacks a hospital. Who does that, man? Right? You guys remember that scene from The Punisher when Frank Castle rolled into the hospital and was just shooting the place up in the TV show? It's like that, man. It's just some villainous stuff, right? I mean, you literally have people on gurneys, the symbiotes attacking them, right? Folks who are just like in the middle of surgery or bleeding out, right? Or like paralyzed or something like that. I mean, it's a slaughterhouse, man. And it keeps talking about how like, give me Spider-Man and I will let all of you leave with your lives, right? I will let all of you guys survive. It's diabolical, dude. It's pretty messed up. But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. So once Miles shows up here, right? Miles has learned from his fight with the Venom symbiote. And that's one of the things that made Miles' story so cool, is because as the reader, much like what we saw with Ultimate Spider-Man Peter Parker, you saw him learn how to become Spider-Man as he was operating as Spider-Man. And that's one of the reasons why, as soon as he shows back up here, he immediately starts using his Venom Blast on Venom. But lest we forget, while Miles has adapted and learned with his Venom Blast and his first fight with Venom, so has the symbiote. And so instead of allowing Miles to stay in close proximity to him for any measure of time, he just starts throwing him around, because he realizes that even with Miles being Spider-Man and having enhanced speed and reflexes and so on and so forth, the most effective thing he can do is to shut Miles down as fast as humanly possible, to literally overpower him, to hammer him so hard that he's completely overwhelmed and exhausted within minutes. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, this Venom symbiote comes in and it's just like, round two, son, ding ding, and like literally takes it to him, man. He beats his ass like he owes him money. And then as soon as that happens, he immediately absorbs Miles. And it's the smartest move for the Venom symbiote to do here. It's the smartest thing he could have possibly done. Now, while this whole thing's watching, Miles' mom is freaking out, right? She's literally watching her son being eaten by like a giant monster. But one of the big moments that came out of this story, right? One of the biggest things that come out of the story is this is when we learn that Miles' mom knew he was Spider-Man, and we didn't know beforehand. Not that I'm aware of, right? As far as I'm aware, before this moment, we never knew that Miles' mom knew that he was Spider-Man. But once she realized that that was the case, she starts begging the Venom symbiote, please let my son go. And the symbiote's just like, your family has caused me a lot of trouble. You have no idea what I've done to get here. And seemingly he's gonna consume her too. But what Miles does is, as he's trapped inside the Venom symbiote, he literally unloads this massive Venom blast. And it's just this really, really amazing moment, because when that happens, we end up finding out the current host of the Venom symbiote is a guy named Marcus. Now, we'll learn more about him here in a second because his motivation is really, really cool. But the other thing that ends up happening here, and this was a huge moment when this happened in the comic, is that Rio, the mother of Miles, is caught in the crossfire with the cops, and she's mortally injured. She's literally killed by the police officers, and everything starts going nuts after that, because what we end up doing is we switch over to Roxxon Industries. Now, while reports are coming out, right, the news is reporting on everything that's going on about the whole Venom symbiote and everything with a guy named Marcus and so on, it is inevitable that Marcus is going to be traced back to Roxxon, because Marcus was an employee of Roxxon. And in fact, that's what they say, right? Like the news says, we're still waiting for official word from Roxxon as to what they know about this man and how this has all come to pass. Was Marcus's violent mutation some sort of experiment or an accident gone wrong? Now, the reality here is that if Roxxon doesn't get out in front of this before things snowball too fast, conspiracy theories and everything will take hold. And so the head of Roxxon, right, the man himself, he says, you'll inform the media that the Roxxon Corporation is working with authorities in all capacities so that this terrible tragedy can be put behind us. But what we're actually doing here is making sure that no one can connect what happened tonight to what's happening here. What we are doing is waiting until this all blows over, and then we will find out exactly what this Marcus was doing with the symbiote in the first place. What we're going to do is wait until no one is watching us, and when I give the word, I want to find out how Spider-Man became Spider-Man and why we can't figure out how to make a Spider-Man for ourselves. And so that's the big thing here, is because Roxxon basically got their hands on a sample of the Venom symbiote following the defeat and death of Eddie Brock Jr. And so Roxxon has been using the symbiote, experimenting on it, and trying to find a way to create their own version of Spider-Man. Now, presumably what Roxxon would do is they would kill Miles Morales' Spider-Man and replace him with their own. And that version of Spider-Man would be beholden to Roxxon. But for Miles himself, when he wakes up the next morning and the reality hits him that his mom is dead, he immediately freaks out. And in feeling the same kind of pain that Peter felt in losing Uncle Ben, he quits, right? He's like, I'm done. He gives up being Spider-Man, tears the suit apart, and wants to have nothing to do with it anymore. Okay, so we are covering Spider-Man, but here's something that I want to throw out there real quick, right? Because I know some people are going to ask the question, Rob, didn't you cover this already? What I covered was Spider-Man 2. Here's the important thing about this, right? Spider-Man is probably one of the most important Spider-Man stories, I'd say, of the last 15 years. And the reason why is because this is the story where Peter Parker first met Miles Morales, right? So, one of the things that we've talked about here over the course of really some of the Miles Morales videos that we've done, and a lot of the Peter Parker videos that we did, is we kind of talked about the nature of the Ultimate Universe, right? So if you guys are familiar with this, we just finished a video yesterday where we talked about that in the Miles Morales one, right? So just kind of bear with me, right? We'll probably have some new people to the channel. I know you guys kind of like to get directly into it, but bear with me for a second while I kind of reiterate this. For the people who are new here, right? Who are new to Marvel Comics, in Marvel, you have a great big huge multiverse, right? Technically, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is considered part of the multiverse that makes up all of Marvel Comics. We know that for a couple different reasons. One, because it actually has a numerical designation among the Marvel multiverse, and two, because there's comics based on it, right? So that kind of brings it closer in line with being part of the Marvel multiverse. But where you had Marvel Comics as it was originally launched in the 1960s, right, with the Fantastic Four #1 and so on and so forth, that's referred to as Earth 616, right? Also known as the main Marvel universe. What we got in the year 2000 was the creation of the Ultimate Universe. And this was an answer to the question, what would it look like if at that point in time in the year 2000, superheroes had just just basically popped up, right? They just kind of emerged for the very first time. What would those superheroes look like? How would they function? How would all that stuff work? And that's basically where you got Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe. Now, Ultimate Spider-Man was exceedingly popular, right? It was hugely popular because in a lot of ways, it was kind of an indirect reboot, right? Marvel didn't really reboot everything with the main Marvel Universe Spider-Man. They just gave us a new one, and people loved it, right? People absolutely loved it. But what you saw was a story where basically Peter Parker died, right? Peter Parker Spider-Man was killed, and it might behoove us to go back and cover that event, right? Cover Cataclysm and the death of Peter Parker, right? It might behoove us to do that just because, we're kind of doing a lot of this stuff because the new Spider-Man game's coming out for the PlayStation. But the idea is that when that version of Peter Parker died, we ended up getting Miles Morales in his place. And when Miles Morales first showed up, there was a lot of naysayers. There were a lot of people who were just kind of like, Miles Morales sucks. He's not really Spider-Man. He's not really Peter Parker, that kind of a thing, because it kind of came from a couple different places. A lot of fans were latched on to the idea of Peter Parker, even when they were reading him before the Ultimate Universe was launched, right? So all they really got was just another alternate reality version of Peter, and they loved it. A lot of people grew attached to Peter Parker Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe when that was their first place to start in Marvel Comics. But by whatever manner and whatever means, a lot of people just didn't want to see things change. This story is, in a lot of ways, kind of Brian Michael Bendis snubbing people who were naysayers of Miles Morales, right? People who were just like, this character's not going to last or anything like that. It was kind of Bendis just being like, no, he will. Like, he's going to be around for a long time. And that's really where this comes from. And I tell you that because it's important that you understand the historical context of this story as we get into it, so you can understand why this story is considered to be so important. With all that out of the way, let us jump to the main story itself. And so what we end up getting here is picking up in the main Marvel Universe, Earth 616, with Peter Parker Spider-Man. And it's Peter Parker just kind of doing the stuff that Peter Parker does, right? Like swinging around, coming across some criminals, some guys who are doing some things they're not supposed to do. But here's the funny thing about this. Because of the fact that this story was written as a way to kind of tie into or kind of bring together the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe, this story was written in such a way to where it was designed to treat people as if they're aware of who Spider-Man is, but they don't really know much about him, right? They don't really know a whole lot about the character, right? So it's kind of reiterating the nature of Peter Parker. And that's one of the things that you see in Marvel Comics. There are certain characters out there who people know who they are, right? People know who Iron Man is now. People know who Spider-Man is. People know who Wolverine is. But knowing who the character is and understanding the history and the context of the character are two distinctly different things. So a lot of people know who Iron Man is, but I doubt they really know anything about the Mandarin, or I doubt they know about stories like Demon in a Bottle and why it's so important. What is it? The Five Nightmares run by Matt Fraction, different things like that, right? Arno Stark, Kieran Gillen's run. A lot of people probably aren't really familiar with that. So the idea is that we're just kind of giving Peter Parker in terms of how Peter Parker operates, which is to say, kind of musing to himself about how much he loves New York City and the fact that New York City is kind of like a thinking, breathing entity, right? That there are so many facets to this city. You've got people who have their nose to the ground and they're just grinding day in and day out, just trying to make it by. You've got people who are just super high up in their ivory towers, the Tony Starks, the Reed Richards, who don't really have to worry about small time things, right? But you kind of have everybody who falls in between, and there's just so many different varying types of people in the city of New York that it's just so unique in that way. What it also has are criminals. There's criminals in New York City, and Spider-Man goes to visit some, and he basically wallops them one or two times, shows them what for, and then of course, ends up pulling over the vehicle, which was their getaway car, and as soon as he's there, he's met by the arrival of the cops, right? And the cops are just like, take off your mask, show us your face, that kind of a thing. Now, the truth about this is I was never really part and parcel to this kind of depiction of Spider-Man, of Peter Parker, and the reason why is because you have had stories over the years where J. Jonah Jameson and the Daily Bugle have kind of managed to sort of turn, the idea of Spider-Man into something where he can't really be trusted, he's a menace. But the long and short of it is that over the years, Spider-Man was largely trusted by society, right? Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He was the good guy, right? He was largely trusted in that way. There have been times where it's waxed and waned, but in this instance, I kind of feel like it should have been one of those things where it's like, thanks, Spider-Man, and then that's kind of it, right? Now, the fact that the cops show up here and he's behind the wheel of a getaway car might give him a little reason to be sus, right? But I don't know why I say that all the time. Mariah started saying sus, and now I say it all the time, right? Like, sus. It's a weird word. But anyway, once he takes off and he kind of, goes and does his thing, he ends up finding this building, this kind of, this office building basically, where the roof has been shattered, right? The glass has been shattered. And he's kind of like, that's a little weird. Now, of course, he ends up being drawn to that location because of a giant bright light, almost kind of an explosion of sorts. And of course, once he gets there, like the whole place kind of seems to be tarnished, right? And there's just this white light or this bright light emanating from it all. Now, as he gets in there and as he starts investigating, his initial thought is this energy source is a little weird. Now, this story was released about a year after Spider-Man Big Time. And for those of you guys who aren't really familiar, if you ever wanted to get into Spider-Man, I always suggest people start with Big Time. We have that whole series covered on my channel, and Big Time was the start of Dan Slott's run. You had Spider-Man and you had Mary Jane, who were like married and all that kind of stuff, and then you got One More Day, then you got Brand New Day, where Marvel basically nullified it all. Because that was just so poorly received, Big Time was kind of Marvel's huge shift with Peter Parker, right? Focusing on like an all new age for Peter Parker Spider-Man. But that's kind of the good place to start, right? Because Dan Slott's run begins with that and runs all the way up through Secret Wars and after Secret Wars into Clone Conspiracy, right? So it's like a 10, almost 15-year long run of Spider-Man. It's very, very lengthy, but I think it's also incredibly good. I think it's an amazing run on Spider-Man. But the whole idea behind this is that that this takes place about a year after that. Now, the reason why I mention that is because I'm not entirely partial to how this is handled by Bendis, right? Bendis is notorious for writing a character and then pretending like nothing anybody did ever happened, right? And it's just like the only things that matter with this character is what I'm doing here, and ignoring continuity in its entirety. Now, whether it's kind of Bendis is always that way, I'm not 100% sure. I wasn't really reading Bendis back when he was part of event publications with Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada. I wasn't really reading him back then. I only really got familiar with Brian Michael Bendis once he actually came into main Marvel itself and was writing like New Avengers, right? And New Avengers was a wholly new thing, so he could kind of get away with that. It's something that I think maybe a result of his huge amount of popularity, and it's kind of like, I'm Bendis, I can do whatever in the heck I want. I don't know if that's really the case or not, but the reason why that matters is because during Spider-Man Big Time, Peter Parker's intelligence had always kind of been downplayed by Marvel Comics, right? They never really kind of elevated Peter Parker to being on par with like Reed Richards or Tony Stark. You always kind of knew he was, but they never really did any of that for him. Instead, what you end up getting here is Peter Parker kind of looking at this and just be like, man, this is weird. He's like, it's not anything alien in nature. Maybe I should get a hold of like Tony Stark or Reed Richards or something like that. During Big Time, one of the big things that Dan Slott did was focus on the intelligence of Peter Parker, and in being like, Peter Parker's actually pretty daggone smart, and he doesn't always need Reed Richards or Tony Stark to solve a problem on his own. That was kind of solidified in a story where there was like a bomb that was going to go off and nobody else could defuse it, and Peter Parker was the one who did, right? So it was kind of elevating his intelligence up and basically telling the reader base, hey, Peter Parker's not as dumb as he's being made out to be. You know, he's not just a Spider-Man, right? He's a super intelligent guy. Let's start treating him that way. So I'm not entirely partial on how this works, but as he starts navigating this room, he starts to realize all this stuff belongs to Mysterio, right? All these things belong to him. And that's when Mysterio tries to sneak up behind Peter and attack him. And of course, Peter Parker's spider sense goes off, and he basically ends up, kind of being aware that he's about to be attacked and manages to dodge out of the way. Now with Mysterio, and one thing that a lot of you guys are probably aware of after having seen Spider-Man Far From Home, Mysterio is a legitimate, credible threat to Peter Parker, right? He's probably one of Peter Parker's most dangerous villains. His ability to cast illusions to basically trick Peter Parker and his spider sense, it can be pretty difficult to overcome Mysterio. And that's one of the reasons why you have, Peter Parker kind of saying here, like, I've got to get this guy down as fast as I can because this guy is a real and serious threat. The other part of this is that Mysterio keeps rambling on about how like Peter Parker's ruining things and he's kind of destroying things and so on and so forth. And then he goes as far as to say, like, you have no idea what you're dealing with, right? You have no idea what I'm capable of. I missed out when you died the first time. I'm not going to miss out this time, right? So right off the bat, our cue is that this is some kind of ability from Mysterio to actually look through into the Ultimate Universe where that version of Peter Parker died. And Mysterio wants to be in that universe where Peter Parker doesn't exist, right? His main nemesis, the person that always foiled his plans, he's just trying to find a way to escape. And so what you end up getting here is Peter just kind of looking at this and saying like, what is this thing, right? Is this some kind of a power generator or whatever this is? It's weird that this is here, but like I can call people that can basically break this down and take this thing apart so we don't really have to worry about it, right? While Peter Parker doesn't really know what's going on with this device, he knows enough about Mysterio to know it's probably not a good thing, right? Like when supervillains start doing weird things that you don't understand, you can usually just assume it's bad, and you're not usually wrong in doing that. It's a good rule of thumb to have. But of course, in his desperation, Mysterio ends up grabbing a handgun and firing it off and then missing Peter Parker and hitting his device. And when that happens, he's yanked through, right? Peter is seemingly yanked through into basically the Ultimate Universe. And this is the first time, one of the reasons why this is so big, this is the very, very first time in the history of Marvel Comics that a character from the main Marvel Universe crossed over into the Ultimate Universe, right? This was a huge deal. Now, the Ultimate Universe, it exists now in Marvel Comics, but it's nowhere near as a big deal as it was back in like the early to mid 2000s, right? At around the time, and even really in the early 2010s when this story was written, this is when the Ultimate Universe was really kind of at its prime, depending on, what you were reading. There was a lot of fall off after the death of Peter Parker. We can't really, that's just an absolute thing. We can't really argue that point. But the death of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe actually made headlines, right? It made national news headlines. And so because of that, there was a lot of interest in the Ultimate Universe, and so it was really a great time to capitalize on that, right, to kind of give us this story. But this is a big deal when this first happened. And so as Peter Parker's there, he's like, okay, this is weird, like it's suddenly daytime. I don't know what that great big huge building is over there. That's the Triskelion, that great big huge tower looking thing off in the water. You guys probably recognize the Triskelion from Captain America, the Winter Soldier. That's where this comes from. That's why we say the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a combination of the Ultimate Universe, the main Marvel Universe, and Earth 98, where the heroes age in real time. It's kind of a combination of those three things. But he ends up traveling back to the building where you had, you know, the whole Mysterio's base of operations and everything popping off, and he basically ends up breaking into the place, only to find out that it's occupied with some girl in a towel, and he's like, my bad. And basically bails out, right? He ends up taking off. From there, he actually ends up rescuing a guy who's, you know, kind of being beat up a little bit. He takes out the two people who were beating this dude up, and he basically says he was just playing pool, and then suddenly they jumped him. But the fact that he's wearing a Peter Parker costume, wearing a Spider-Man costume, does not go unnoticed by this guy. And he's like, look, I appreciate you saving me, but like, it's really in bad taste for you to wear that costume right now. What's more so than that, he's like, you know, we all need heroes, but that was Peter Parker's costume. And that's one of the big things to know. When Peter Parker died, and even Peter Parker as Spider-Man, his identity was known, right? When all that popped off, his identity was known to the world. People were like, the world needs to know that this is the kid who tried to save everybody, who died a hero. That's why the death of Peter Parker was so massive in the Ultimate Universe, right? Like, imagine, for example, that like in the main Marvel Universe and Marvel Comics, that Iron Man dies, and it's this great big huge event that crosses over every single comic that they have, right? It's like the death of Iron Man, you know, the Incredible Hulk tie-in and the Captain America tie-in and all that kind of stuff, right? Like everything ties into just the fact that Iron Man died and how everybody's coping with it. That's what the death of Peter Parker was. It was just huge. It was massive because Spider-Man had never actually been killed off in Marvel Comics with no intention of bringing him back, right? That's just never happened before, right? I mean, Marvel kind of tried it with the Clone Saga, but like, nah, it was never gonna happen. With the Ultimate Universe, it's the way it is. Peter Parker's been dead. You know, he's like the Peter Parker Spider-Man concept is dead, and Miles Morales had taken it over and has been that way ever since. So it was kind of a big deal. It was a huge deal when it happened. But this guy, the fact that this guy reveals that they know who Peter Parker is really throws like the main Marvel Universe Peter Parker off, because his identity is something that he keeps insanely close guarded. Right now, in Civil War, he revealed it to the world just as kind of a proof of the fact that he trusted Iron Man's superhero registration. But of course, as we saw in the aftermath of that Brand New Day, that Doctor Strange came along and just magicked everybody's memory of Peter Parker's identity out of their heads, right? He's just like, you magic, and then nobody remembered that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and that was essentially it, right? That was basically it. That's probably what they're going to end up doing in Spider-Man 3, the movie. But the whole point behind this is that this throws Peter Parker for a loop, because he's kind of like, okay, that's crazy. Like, wherever it is, they're referring to me in the third person. So one, this guy doesn't know who I am, but he knows who Peter Parker is. So that means there was a Peter Parker here in this place. What in the world is going on right now? And so what ends up happening is he's ultimately met by the arrival of Miles Morales. And Miles Morales pops up and he's just like, no way, right? Because to the eyes of Miles Morales, this is the Ultimate Universe version of Peter Parker. It's like Peter Parker has come back. That's what kind of blew things off, right? That's what makes Miles Morales kind of go nuts here. Okay, so we are picking back up again with Spider-Man Part 2, and this week we're going to kind of run through a whole bunch of Spider-Man related content, mostly because of the fact that the new Spider-Man game's coming out. We kind of want to be done in time for all of that stuff. But in this one, we pick up with Part 2. Right now, again, for those of you guys who are just joining us here, Spider-Man is the first time that Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe meets Miles Morales, the new Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe, right? This was a big deal when it first came out. Now, we ended up having this happening by way of the fact that Mysterio had basically managed to create some kind of interdimensional portal. And the result was that when Peter Parker came upon it and ended up fighting Mysterio, Peter Parker ended up being thrown through, right? He was kind of sucked through more than anything else, but Peter Parker passed through it and ended up in the Ultimate Universe. What this does is it wakes up with Mysterio in the aftermath of that. Now, as soon as Mysterio comes to, his immediate response is, really, bro? He's incredibly pissed off, right? Because he's just like, this is the worst thing. Now, it's not like super complicated or anything. That's one of the great things about Brian Michael Bendis when he was writing really Ultimate Spider-Man and Miles Morales Spider-Man. I always say Bendis is better when he's writing kids or teenagers. When it comes to adults, he's not that good. But with kids or teenagers, he's amazing, right? So writing Miles Morales, he was super good at it. But the idea behind this is that from Mysterio's perspective, he does not want to run into another situation where Peter Parker exists. That him basically stumbling across the Ultimate Universe was a universe where Peter Parker Spider-Man didn't really exist. Peter Parker had never heard of Mysterio. And so with, him, really presuming that Miles Morales, that he knew Miles existed, that Miles could be somebody he could overcome pretty quickly, right? Because by and large, when when it comes to Marvel Comics, villains from the main Marvel universe are usually more powerful than villains from the Ultimate Universe, and even main characters themselves. Even somebody like the Phoenix Force, or like Thor or Loki, they're really powerful characters in relation to their Ultimate Universe counterparts, because the Ultimate Universe was designed to be more toned down and realistic. Even in the realm of comic books, if you're writing a character and really a series of stories that exist as close as you can get to the real world, you probably don't want to really see these wild flights of fantasy when it comes to ridiculous levels of power, right? Like the Marquis of Death, different things like that. But the whole idea here is that what you end up having is Mysterio, who basically kind of brings out this kind of avatar. And this is basically a version of himself, kind of a robotic version of himself that can go into the Ultimate Universe in his stead, right? Because if you're Mysterio, you don't want to get yourself killed going into the Ultimate Universe. You send a robot in your place. And so switching over to Peter and Miles, this is one of the interesting things here, albeit a little strange. And the reason why is because initially Peter doesn't know what to make of Miles, and Miles doesn't know what to make of Peter, right? He's like, what in the world's going on? And Peter hasn't figured out that he's in the Ultimate Universe because he doesn't know what the Ultimate Universe is. He just knows he's in some other place, right? And seemingly picking up pretty quickly on the fact that he's in some kind of an alternate dimension. And so because of this, there's a kind of fight that starts to break out between Peter and Miles, because Peter's like, okay, you're freaking me out, right? Because they keep going back and forth, right? Peter's like, what's the deal here? And Miles is like, you tell me. And Peter's like, is it a clone thing? And he's like, what's a clone thing? And it's like, you tell me. He's like, I thought this was some kind of Nick Fury test. Is it a Nick Fury test? And Miles is like, you tell me. And it's like, just kind of going back and forth, right? So Peter gets frustrated, gets a little tussed, and ends up attacking Miles, right? Ends up going after Miles. But Miles, for his part, immediately dodges Spider-Man's webbing, right? And so from there, what you end up getting is this really interesting situation where Miles is able to bob and weave and duck all of Spider-Man's attacks and then counter proportionally. Now, this is where things get a little wonky, right? This is where things get a little... I don't know how I feel about that, right? Because keep in mind, Miles has not been formally trained by anybody at S.H.I.E.L.D. yet, right? In anybody in the Triskelion, by Nick Fury or any of those guys. And so he is still, in a lot of ways, flying by the seat of his pants. And so the fact that we're kind of getting this version of Miles, who over his time in being Spider-Man, is able to go toe-to-toe with Peter Parker, who's been playing this role for a very long time, and not only go toe-to-toe, manage to dodge his attacks and then shock him, is a little bit stunning here. But, no pun intended, is a little bit stunning here. But the funny thing about this too is we can also kind of play into it from Peter's perspective, that Peter is not fighting to like beat the crap out of Miles, right? He's not looking to like overcome Miles. He's looking to kind of subdue him, if anything else, right? Probably web him up or something like that. If Peter were fighting Miles in the same vein that he was fighting somebody like Rhino or like Dr. Octopus or somebody like that, the fight probably would have gone a much different way, and it would have been over much, much faster. The reality is, which way this fight would have gone depends on which character you like more. That's basically what it is, right? If you're a fan of Miles, you're like, oh, of course Miles could overcome Peter Parker. If you don't believe me, just ask me and I'll tell you. But if you're a fan of Peter Parker, it's the exact same thing, right? It's like, no, Peter Parker definitely could have gotten the upper hand on Miles, right? I mean, I know because I'm right? I mean, that's kind of how we as comic book fans get. We need no other evidence than our own opinion, and that's basically it. Now, the funny thing is, Miles actually goes to take the mask off Peter, which Miles should know by now is kind of a no-no. That's just something that you don't do. And that leads to Peter basically reacting, waking up and then kicking Miles off the ledge of the building, right? And then from there, Peter's like, dude, I think I just killed this kid. I think I just did this kid in. I do not need that on my conscience, right? I do not need this on my conscience. Now, unbeknownst to him, of course, Miles has initiated his invisibility power, but nonetheless, Peter's just kind of like, okay, I think I killed this kid. This is a problem. We got to find this kid, right? And then Miles pops back up, gets the upper hand on Peter, kicks him, and then of course, Peter ends up kind of spinning some webbing out. And then from there, he shoots his webbing into Miles' mask and yanks his mask off, right? And that's when he's kind of like, all right, here, it's time for you to come clean, right? Like, how are you, Spider-Man? What's going on here? Like, give me all the skin and give me all the information. Now, the response of Miles is, you have to give me my mask back, right? Like, anybody out here could see that I'm Spider-Man and I have to keep my family and my identity protected. Like, give me my mask back. Now, you would expect Peter to respond and say, yeah, I kind of understand where you're coming from. That's kind of my thing too. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and Peter needs information. The problem with this is he didn't really understand why Miles got the upper hand on him the first time, and so he didn't really even think about the Venom Blast this time, which Miles uses, channels it into the webbing, and then takes out Peter. It's genius. And that was one of the cool things that made Miles so interesting in the early comics, is when you were reading his character, you could actually watch him become a better Spider-Man as you were reading the comic. And so with every single story arc that you read, he was a better version of Spider-Man at the end of that story than he was before he started the story, right? It was really, really cool. But with regards to Peter, what you end up getting here is Miles basically using Peter's web shooters, right? To kind of swing them, down to the ground and then kind of get them onto a roof and then get them to safety. And when they collapse, right, he ends up taking the mask off Peter and he realizes, oh my God, this is Peter Parker. Now for him, he doesn't know this is Peter from the Marvel Universe, from the main Marvel Universe, right? He thinks it's like Peter Parker returned from his universe. So he's like, I have no idea what I do here, right? And that's when he kind of looks over to the Triskelion and Peter Parker's taken to the SHIELD headquarters, right? From there, he meets with Nick Fury. Now, most of the guys who read the Ultimate Universe know two things about Nick Fury. The first one is that he was based on Samuel L. Jackson, right? And in fact, Samuel L. Jackson actually threatened to sue Marvel, but they ended up letting him play the role of Nick Fury in the MCU. So the lawsuit never happened, right? That's why we got Samuel L. Jackson, Nick Fury. But the other thing about this is that Nick Fury is highly skeptical, right? He is a super suspicious guy. And so when he starts asking questions, when he starts asking him well, at least when he refers to him as Peter, and Peter's like, do you know me? And he's like, I know the name, and it's that kind of a thing. The two of them start talking to each other, and it's kind of a cool bit of a conversation here, right? Because Peter even makes reference to the fact that I know your eye patch, but it's one of these little tidbit things. But when he asks him are you Peter Parker? It's like, well, it's not that straightforward. And it's like, okay, well then give me an answer. Give me this one hypothetical answer that you have. And Peter basically reiterates his whole fight with Mysterio, then passing through the portal and then ending up here and all that kind of stuff. And Nick Fury's kind of like, huh. Okay. I mean, I could probably buy that story. It's so far-fetched, it might just be true, right? It's one of those things. So he just kind of ends up giving Peter credibility here. Now, the reality of this is that Bendis does this just for the sake of keeping the story moving forward. Under any other comic in the Ultimate Universe, Nick Fury would be like, no, I'm not buying that. You're going to stay in this cell until you tell me what's actually going on. And he would legitimately leave him there. Nick Fury would have done that if you sat down, if this happened in the Ultimates and it was anybody else besides Spider-Man, if it was Ultimates or like the Ultimate Fantastic Four or the Ultimate X-Men, Nick Fury would be like, no, man, I'm not buying into that nonsense, that crazy malarkey, not buying into any of that stuff, right? So he would just leave him there. But Bendis does this for the sake of keeping the story moving forward. What he ends up doing is basically handing Peter over to Miles and say, okay, it's your all's job to go do your own thing, right? Your all's job to get this whole thing sorted out and find out what's going on. And so what Peter does is, by virtue of what Nick Fury told him, the way that Miles is acting, that kind of thing, he starts to put two and two together. And so what he does is he really kind of asks the big question, tell me, kid, in this universe, is Peter Parker dead, right? Is Peter Parker not alive here anymore? And that's what's kind of nuts, is because before Miles can really give him an answer and explain everything, both of them are shot through the helicopter by this avatar of Mysterio. And in turn, Miles basically saves both of them and then kind of takes both guys, or really takes him and the pilot down to their safety, right? But basically Mysterio's here and starts launching his attack against Peter and Miles. So this is when we go from Miles Morales meeting Peter Parker to Miles fighting Peter to Miles and Peter teaming up. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with Spider-Man. I almost said Spider-Man 2, with Spider-Man. We're picking back up with Miles Morales and Peter Parker. Now, this is kind of a three-pronged event, right? Like the first time, in the first issue they met, and the second issue they fought, and this one they team up. So it's kind of a cool bit of storytelling here, right? But in the instance where they had initially fought each other and things had kind of popped off, and they were sort of coming to terms, and with regards to this reality, they're suddenly met by this avatar of Mysterio. Now, again, this is kind of the robot slash, well, really just straight robot that Mysterio is using. He is in the main Marvel universe, but he's piloting this and it's moving around in the Ultimate Universe, right? And so because of that, as soon as it takes down the helicopter that Peter Parker and Miles Morales were in, the two of them start to team up to fight Mysterio. The problem with this is that Miles Morales has never really fought anybody like Mysterio before. And even Mysterio, as he exists in the main Marvel universe, doesn't really exist the same way in the Ultimate Universe. To kind of give you guys some perspective of the big differences between these two things, because I believe by this point Doctor Strange is dead, there came a point in the Ultimate Universe where Doctor Strange fought Dormammu. And in the main Marvel Universe, Doctor Strange has fought Dormammu a multitude of times and won pretty much every single time. In the Ultimate Universe, he fights him once and dies. It's nuts. Like, he's painfully outclassed in comparison to the power that Dormammu has. Like, he kills him with a quickness, and that's basically it, right? That it happens so incredibly fast. Because you're talking about Mysterio, who still maintained his ability to create illusions despite using a kind of avatar form, you end up having Peter Parker, who picks up on what's going on. Now, it took him a moment to realize it, because he's like, something weird is going on, right? It's a more powerful strain of the illusion that he normally uses, but what he ends up doing is conjuring all of Spider-Man's villains and the things that Miles Morales fears the most, right? So basically, their greatest fears between the two of them. And with this happening, you really only ever see the Scorpion from the Ultimate Universe. You see Uncle Aaron, the Prowler from the Ultimate Universe, and Omega Red from the Ultimate Universe, but you only really see those because those are only really the villains that Miles Morales has fought so far. For Peter Parker, it's a whole host of stuff, right? It's a whole host of things, Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus and all that stuff. But that's what makes this so bonkers, is because of the fact that Miles doesn't really know how to navigate this. Now, this kind of illusion that Mysterio creates, that's one of the big things to understand. His illusions can be tangible. If they're powerful enough, they can be tangible. And that's one of the big differences, is that in the early days, if I remember correctly, in the early days, his illusions were more or less intangible, right? So he could trick you into believing you were somewhere, but he couldn't really make things interact with you. In this instance, he can, and it's really kind of been that way for a number of years in Marvel Comics. But Mysterio uses his powers to quite literally have these guys attack Miles Morales and Spider-Man and Peter Parker, right? So it's like Venom and it's Carnage, it's all these guys. And this is incredibly dangerous because these are forces that Miles isn't used to facing off against. But this is one of the big differences here, is that Miles hasn't really faced off against Mysterio before, but at the same time, this kind of magic doesn't necessarily exist inside the Ultimate Universe. Now, this may seem like it would naturally work against Miles Morales. He's basically being exposed to something that he hasn't really seen before and wouldn't really know how to navigate those waters. But instead of doing what Peter Parker seems to be doing here, which is kind of overthinking it to a degree, instead, Miles actually manages to get the upper hand and basically incapacitate Mysterio temporarily, if for no other reason than to basically take down his avatar form and then essentially destroy it, right? Like destroy that body, because Miles picks up on the fact this is the reason why it's happening. Now, again, this is one of those instances in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics where people were a little finicky. They were like, I have a hard time believing that Miles would be able to pick up on this and Peter Parker couldn't. You're talking about two characters from two different realities who navigate waters differently. When this story first came out, there was one group of people who looked at this and said, okay, the only reason Miles is able to figure this out on his own is because Bendis is writing it, and Bendis is pushing Miles and really wants him to be like the new Ultimate Universe Spider-Man. And of what use would his character be if he didn't have some kind of caveat over Peter Parker from, Peter Parker in general, right? Even from the main Marvel Universe. It's one of these interesting concepts, one of these interesting quagmires. But again, with regards to Mysterio, he's one of these villains where by all standards of measurement, he would have gotten the upper hand on Miles Morales, because what makes Mysterio's, his powers so incredibly potent is he's much like Mastermind or somebody like Charles Xavier. Not in so much as the powers he possesses, he's just an illusionist, right? He doesn't really have telepathy or anything like that. But much like those guys, his powers can totally envelope you and convince you that you're somewhere that you're not, right? Mysterio gets his hands on you, he can convince you that you're a world away, and you're in, some pirate land and you're fighting against pirates or something like that. Whether or not you're able to actually pick up on that are two distinctly different things, right? Creating that illusion, if you're of sound mind, you'll immediately know that something's off, right? Regardless, when everything kind of pops off, Peter Parker actually ends up taking off. He doesn't leave the universe, he just goes to explore it. And what you end up having are the Ultimates who arrive here on the scene with Miles Morales. Now, one of the big things that goes on here is, again, because these characters were designed to be a lot more toned down than the versions that we saw in the Ultimate Universe, that Tony Stark doesn't really know how to navigate this technology, right? Like in the main Marvel Universe, he would have picked it up right off the bat and just been like, okay, so here's what's going on with this. Instead, in the Ultimate Universe, his intelligence is a little more grounded, right? So it's not as though he's just wildly out there as intelligent as the story needs him to be. Instead, it's a little more grounded here. So he recognized it insofar as it's an exceedingly, advanced form of technology, and that it's an avatar that's basically being used by, this Mysterio guy to control this avatar version from someplace else. But in terms of being able to reverse engineer it almost instantaneously, that doesn't happen here, right? That doesn't really take place here. Now, for Miles' part, of course, he ends up asking Nick Fury, where'd the other Spider-Man go? And Fury's response is, he went out there to explore things. And that's the nature of this, right? When you're someone like Spider-Man and you face off against Mysterio and you've gone through his illusions so many times, the biggest struggle he has here is trying to figure out whether any of this is real or false. That's the biggest struggle he has at the moment, because you got to kind of think of this from Peter's perspective. He was in his own universe, he was facing off against Mysterio, found himself yanked through a portal, ended up in this new reality where he's dead, there's a new Spider-Man that took his place, and that there's a Nick Fury there, who seemingly allowed the two of them to team up, and then Mysterio's avatar appears, he ends up facing off against all of his villains, even though they're illusions, and then of course Miles Morales ends up destroying that avatar, and now Peter's basically exploring. In his mind, all of this could be the illusion, and that's the truth of the thing, right? That's the truth of the thing here. When you're facing off against Mysterio, this could all be illusion. It's entirely possible that Bendis could have ended this story and it was all just one great huge illusion created by Mysterio, and it would work. It would be believable because he's done it before, right? That's the advancement of Mysterio's illusions, is that it screws with your head so incredibly badly. But as we know, Peter Parker is actually in the Ultimate Universe. And so he basically starts tracking different things down, right? He goes to the place that would have been his apartment. He ends up finding a corner store. He asks her, like, how long has this been here? She's like, I don't know. How long have you worked here? I've worked here 2 years, you know? And he's like, okay, so there was never an apartment building here, you know, there was never an apartment here. And so basically he never stayed here. The other thing that ends up happening after he, you know, beats up some guy who runs into the place and robs it is he asks her for, you know, for a tablet that can help him access the internet. And when he does, he finds an article that the Spider-Man in this universe really did die here. And that everybody really knew that he was Peter Parker, that he was a high school student from Queens. And so it's one of these things where it's kind of like, I really am in a universe where I'm dead. The other part of that is, of course, she has this little necklace around her neck. And of course, it's her way of paying respects to Peter Parker as Spider-Man. And then he's like, you need to tell me exactly what happened to Peter Parker in this universe. And so what we end up doing is we basically end up picking up, you know, some period of time later with Aunt May and with Gwen Stacy from the Ultimate Universe, and Peter Parker shows up on their doorstep, right? Like literally just shows up there. And this is one of the most amazing things here. This is one of the most amazing moments because this is Peter Parker coming to grips with Gwen Stacy, who is still alive in this universe, and Aunt May, and having to face the fact that in their mind, he's dead. And so it's kind of like, wow, like this is one of those things. It's a hyper emotional story if you're a Peter Parker fan, right? It's kind of nuts. It's Peter Parker re-encountering Aunt May and Gwen Stacy. It's kind of nuts. Okay, we're picking back up again with Spider-Man, which is the conclusion of the story where Peter Parker meets Miles Morales for the very, very first time, right? Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe meets the Ultimate Spider-Man, Miles Morales. And the whole idea behind this is that we pick up with Peter Parker following his kind of encounter alongside Miles with Mysterio, who basically used a kind of robot version of himself to move into the Ultimate Universe or to travel to the Ultimate Universe. Peter Parker has essentially traveled to meet the Ultimate Universe's version of Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson. Now keep in mind, the last time they saw Spider-Man, it was their version of Peter Parker and he died. And largely there was just kind of the grieving process that went into it. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the early Miles Morales comics that we did is that there did come a point when Miles took on the Spider-Man costume and was met by Aunt May and Gwen Stacy. And they were kind of like, look, if you're gonna do this, understand that you're living up to a legacy much bigger than yourself, right? You don't just simply put on the Spider-Man costume and do your thing. You're living up to the legacy that my nephew created, and you stand for everything he stood for. So this is not a thing to take lightly, right? So it was kind of, initially they were against it, but it's one of these things where it's kind of like, okay, you know, we can sort of get on board once they realize the character of Miles Morales and what he had to offer. But the problem with this is that when Peter shows up, he's wearing the original Spider-Man costume. And as soon as Aunt May sees this, she gets pissed, right? Because he basically showed his face. And her thought is that it's some kind of a joke, right? Gwen Stacy shows up and starts kicking the crap out of Peter Parker, thinking that he's pulling a stunt too. And it's not until Miles shows up and says, no, it's really actually Peter, right? It's not somebody pulling a trick or something like that, not somebody being a jerk. I don't really know of a reasonable human being that would show up on the doorstep of a woman and like basically two chicks who lost somebody close to them dressed as that person, right? I mean, if somebody were to do that, I would I would stand by and just watch them get the crap kicked out of them. I'd record it and then just be like, yeah, man, this guy kind of had it coming. Like, that'd be my response. I'd be like, yeah, man, like they were kind of a dick. They sort of had this coming, right? Nobody do anything. Let them get their just desserts. But this is actually Peter, right? This is actually Peter Parker here. And when Miles comes to his rescue, that's when Aunt May and Gwen Stacy basically start to listen, right? And Peter's initial response is like I thought initially I died. I thought something happened. Like, I didn't really know what was going on, how I ended up here. You know, I've only recently been putting the pieces together. I never should have come here, right? I never should have come here to this place. You know, I'm sorry I did this to you. And then basically Aunt May passes out, right? Now at that point, we switch over to the Ultimate Universe Tony Stark and Nick Fury, right? Now, Nick Fury, we've talked about before. Ultimate Universe Iron Man, we've never really had a big discussion about. One of the big things to understand here is that Ultimate Iron Man, when he first showed up, was designed to be a more grounded version of Tony Stark from the main Marvel Universe, right? So not as intelligent, because even Tony in the main Marvel Universe, his intelligence, even for the realm of comics, borderline's questionable, right? Like, how could a person possibly be that smart? This version of Tony is really smart, but he is a version of intelligence we would expect to see here in the real world, right? Hence the nature of the Ultimate Universe, kind of reflection of the real world the way it exists now. And so he's not really able to pick up or really figure out what Mysterio, what's going on with Mysterio's character, right? How to reverse engineer the circuitry, where the signal's coming from, any, you know, all that kind of stuff. The reality of this is there's an infinite number of universes out there, right? And Tony just doesn't have the ability to trace his signal back to its origin point. Now, if this were in the main Marvel Universe, the main Marvel Tony Stark would have figured it out like that, right? He would have figured it out so fast because it's what the story called for. But the idea of the Ultimate Universe was to write more realistic stories, right? And And really, if you're talking about an infinite number of universes, there really wouldn't be a way to trace the signal all the way back to its origin point, because it's not like it's a rope that leads from the main Marvel universe and all they have to do is just follow the breadcrumbs to get to its location. It doesn't really work that way, at least not for anybody here. And so at the end of the day, Tony doesn't really have any answers here. He's like, the only way for me to really get some answers is to talk to that alternate reality version of Spider-Man, to talk to Peter Parker. It's the only way for me to really figure out what it is that's going on here. Now, the funny comment he makes is, I'm surprised that you let Miles Morales run around with Peter Parker, right? I figured you would have cracked him over the head, thrown him into a hole, and basically grabbed like the main Peter and done the same thing, right? Kind of, kept Miles Morales under wraps so that he wouldn't really have any idea what's going on, and then basically took Peter and just kind of locked him up. But the idea behind this is that Fury really feels a bit of, regret when it comes to Peter, right? Peter was never properly trained to become a superhero. He was never properly trained. He was never really inducted the way that he was supposed to be. He was just kind of allowed to do his thing. And that led to his eventual death. And Nick Fury felt a lot of responsibility for that. That's why when you go and you read Cataclysm, there's a lot of focus put on Nick Fury and the guilt he feels for the death of Peter Parker, because when he could have trained him or he could have helped him to become a better hero, he didn't. Instead, it was just kind of him doing his thing. And so with that guilt in mind, along with promises that he made, it's kind of like, we're just gonna let them work it out together, right? Which is actually the right move. The best move for Nick Fury to make is really for Peter, Aunt May, Gwen Stacy, to all kind of come to terms with this on their own. And so once Aunt May wakes up, you basically have Peter like telling stories, to Miles and to Gwen Stacy, them sharing stories with him, that kind of a thing, and kind of going back and forth, right? And Peter's coming to this realization, there's massive differences between this reality and the one that he's from. Now, we as the reader know that. One of the funny things that goes on is Gwen Stacy kind of starts poking and prodding and is like, is there a version of me in your universe? And Peter's like, yeah, but she's a little bit older than you are. She's about my age. And she's like, well, I mean, like, are you dating her? And Peter's like, I mean, not really. Like, I'm basically dating Mary Jane Watson, right? Which is what Gwen Stacy calls. And then as soon as this kind of explanation goes on that Mary Jane is like a supermodel, which she's not in the Ultimate Universe, right? She's just like a nerdy girl. And when it's like she's a supermodel and all that kind of stuff, like Gwen Stacy's kind of shocked to find out that like Mary Jane Watson is this hugely popular, world-renowned model. And it's kind of like, wow, that's a little crazy. But when she starts asking, what about me, right? Like, what am I then? Like, what's going on with me? Peter's like, we should probably talk about something else. I don't have the heart to tell you that the Green Goblin threw you off a bridge and I shot my webbing at your foot and broke your neck in the process, because that's basically what happened. I don't care what anybody says. She was not dead before Spider-Man got there. I don't care what anybody says. But, it's kind of an interesting thing, because it's like, there are parts of his reality he doesn't really want to divulge, because who knows how Gwen Stacy would react if it was like, well, you're dead and I'm the reason why. Then it's kind of like, get out of this house, right? I don't want you here. But it's really kind of new to her to learn, or really fascinating for her to learn that there's whole other worlds and dimensions out there. Now, for her part, Aunt May is a lot more reserved here, right? She's not nearly as excited as Gwen Stacy is. She's kind of bracing herself for the idea that it's not actually Peter Parker, that it's like, well, we don't really know if it's Peter Parker. We don't really know if it's him, right? We don't know if that's the case. It could be somebody else pretending to be him. Now, in fact, like, it really is him. We know that. Miles Morales believes it. Gwen Stacy believes it. But Aunt May's doing this because in her heart of hearts, if she gives into this and then it turns out to be false, she'd lose it, right? Like, it would just be the most crushing experience, because for her, when she kind of asked Peter, what led you to become this person, right? When he kind of starts talking to her about like Uncle Ben's the reason why he does this, that Uncle Ben, of course, is dead in his reality, but the fact that he could have saved Uncle Ben and he didn't is the reason why he became a superhero the way that he did, and the idea that he could basically help other people and in a lot of ways atone for his past mistake. He basically runs off the statement, with great power, and then she finishes it, comes great responsibility. Now, it should be, must come great responsibility. The fact that this is a lesson that Peter was taught by Uncle Ben tells Aunt May everything she needs to know, that it really is him. And that's what she kind of gives herself over and says, we thought like we lost you, right? We lost you and we didn't even get to say goodbye. And that's the important thing here, right? That's the important thing to understand. That's why Aunt May kept herself reserved in this part, right? Because if she had said like, okay, yeah, you're probably Peter, and let her whole self believe it, and then it turned out to just be some alternate reality version of Peter who was evil or something like that, but wasn't like this alternate reality counterpart to the one that she knew, which is to say a good guy who fights the good fight and does what heroes do, then it would have broken her in her entirety, right? Like the inability of her to say goodbye, the chance that the fact that she never got to tell Peter that she was proud of him, that she loved him, right? To never be able to say, I'm sorry, or any of that stuff, right? To basically like confess or to kind of get to say her last goodbyes to him is something that's always haunted her. Having Peter here, this alternate reality version of Peter, even though she knows it's not her actual nephew, she knows it's not the Peter Parker from the Ultimate Universe, gives her a chance to effectively say goodbye, right? To say her goodbyes and indirectly say it it to Peter Parker from Ultimate Universe to give her closure. It's basically what this does, something that she's never had this entire time. And so Miles Morales, looking out the window, realizes, okay, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s on their way, we need to go, right? Because S.H.I.E.L.D. is a lot more seedy in the Ultimate Universe than they are in the main Marvel Universe. In the main Marvel Universe, they're still kind of jerks, but like they're more inclined to work with you than against you. In the Ultimate Universe, they're like a police force almost, right? I mean, not specifically, but in terms of like how they function, right? Like they do their thing, and all there are just people who stand in the way is basically all that it is. But of course, Peter ends up saying goodbye to everybody here, and then of course he ends up getting in the car with Nick Fury, Miles Morales, and it's kind of a funny thing because Nick Fury asks, like, is there a Nick Fury where you come from? And he's like, yeah, but he's kind of a white guy. And then like Nick Fury's like, sorry to hear that, man. Which is kind of a funny thing. But again, it gives Aunt May the closure she needs. And that's why when the story came out, it was so huge. It was wrapping up all these plot threads, right? All these little things that have been left hanging. And the reality is that if anybody but Brian Michael Bendis had taken this over, we probably would have never seen this, right? But Bendis started off with the Ultimate Spider-Man. He originally created it. It makes sense that he would basically end it here and kind of continue things on with Miles. And that's why Spider-Man is so important. It's one part wrapping up plot threads that Bendis never got to wrap up after the death of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe and the Cataclysm story. And it was a way to kind of officially transition into Miles. And we'll find out more why that's the case once we get to the end of this. But when he really meets with, Tony Stark, he's kind of like, okay, so there's a few differences here. Like one, the Tony Stark in my universe stopped drinking a while ago, which Nick Fury loves. And two, it's obvious this guy's not as smart. And so with Tony kind of being like, look, like I need to know where his home is. I need to know where your universe is. When Peter starts to point him in that direction, then it turns into, okay, then we could at the very least figure out how to get you back, right? We could figure out how to reverse engineer this stuff. Now, make no mistake, Tony Stark's not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. Tony Stark's doing this one part because he was directed by Nick Fury, but two, because he can get something out of it, right? I mean, this is a level of technology that Tony just doesn't have access to. Being able to attain this technology and use it for his own ends is a huge benefit, right? It's something that he desperately wants here. And so once they're basically looking at the broadcast that Mysterio has been putting out, over the internet, all day long and for however many days he's been here, Miles picks up on the fact that one of these buildings is actually in Brooklyn, right? He's like, one of these buildings is in Brooklyn. I'm familiar with it. And so they know exactly where it is Mysterio is operating out of, right? They know his base of operations. Once they locate that, Nick Fury calls in everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean an entire S.H.I.E.L.D. strike team alongside Spider-Man and alongside the Ultimate Thor. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with the conclusion of Spider-Man. Yes, we are. We are wrapping up the Spider-Man event, and this is probably the single most important part of the story. Not necessarily because of what's happened so far, but because of the future of Miles Morales. So what we end up doing here is we initially pick up with Mysterio, and Mysterio is suffering from the same problem that every supervillain suffers from: stupidity. So the idea behind this with Mysterio, is that he comes to the realization that he actually unintentionally defeated Spider-Man. That with Spider-Man being whisked off into this other dimension where Peter Parker in that reality is dead, that it leaves no Spider-Man in this universe, right? In the main Marvel universe. There is no Peter Parker here, right? He's off in the Ultimate Universe somewhere. And it was something that Mysterio had not really thought of before. And now he realizes it, like, man, dude, okay, like I actually defeated Spider-Man. But then the question becomes, why isn't it enough? Right? Like, why is it not enough? He's like, I have to see it, right? I have to see him suffer and die. I'll just take a peek for myself just for one moment. Now, this is Brian Michael Bendis being Brian Michael Bendis. If it were me writing the story, it would be like, oh man, dude, I won, cool, the end. And that would be it, right? It would be Mysterio realizing he basically got the upper hand on Peter Parker and there's no more Spider-Man here. Such as it is, Bendis wanted to tell the story. And so basically Mysterio comes to the realization that he wants to actually see Spider-Man suffer and die. And so he basically reactivates the portal and takes a peek inside, only for webbing to come flying out and to basically attach itself to him. And then of course you have Peter Parker, you have Miles Morales, and the Ultimates team who's there, right? The Ultimate Avengers who are all there. And it's kind of like, well, crap, right? Like, well, damn, like that's basically it, right? Like, okay, I mean, who could have possibly seen that coming? The cool thing about this though, is that one thing to understand with Mysterio is he's usually always got an ace up his sleeve. And that's one of the things that makes him so dangerous, right? And so where you have Nick Fury, you've got the rest of the guys who are kind of like, cool, the day's saved. Keep in mind, they're not used to the kind of villains you have in the main Marvel universe where somehow they always have some kind of an escape plan or something like that. Remember, the main Marvel universe is a lot less realistic than the Ultimate Universe was. And so Mysterio immediately types away and just starts releasing a whole host of these chemicals and sets off an explosion. And when that happens, basically everybody here, so like Iron Man, Nick Fury, Miles Morales, all these various guys are met by what are essentially their worst nightmares, right? That's literally what they're exposed to. Using the power of Mysterio, he exposes all of them to their worst nightmares, right? So you've got all the Ultimates who are dead at the hands of Tony Stark, which of course is definitely an allusion to what we saw in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You've got Nick Fury who's watching the world on fire, watching the world burn. Green Goblin has killed Aunt May in front of, really Dr. Octopus and Green Goblin have killed Aunt May in front of Spider-Man. And then you've got the Prowler who killed Miles Morales' mother and father. And so because of that, where everybody else is kind of succumbing to this, Miles sort of succumbs to it a little bit, but then manages to get the upper hand on it, even if only for a moment. And when that happens, he realizes Mysterio's making a break for the portal and he tackles Mysterio. Now, by all standards of measurement, Miles should have been 100% incapacitated here. And again, that's kind of the critique of Bendis, right? Bendis is just, well, of course Miles Morales has to be on top. He's the guy that I'm writing right now. He's the main Spider-Man. We can't have him lose, right? So it's kind of like, okay, you know, it's sort of, you just kind of go with it in this story, right? It's just kind of the way that Bendis does it. But where you end up having Mysterio, who of course uses his powers on Miles yet again, he almost gets the upper hand. Miles dodges the attack, goes invisible, and then Mysterio, trying to figure out what happens, ends up being attacked by Miles again. Now, again, this is kind of Bendis basically saying like, this is how capable Miles is. Now, the reality of this is that while this was kind of, I wouldn't say far-fetched, but kind of like, what in the world's going on here? You know, back in the day, in this day and age, it's common practice, and it kind of makes sense. I think that with this story and Miles being able to overcome Mysterio so fast, despite Mysterio's abilities, was really more of just Bendis wanting to tell the story, as opposed to just kind of letting it play out organically. In reality, having somebody like Mysterio was probably not the best bet. It probably should have been somebody more like Dr. Octopus, because Mysterio's powers are not limited to just some kind of tentacles attached to his back that go after you, that he messes with your mind, he messes with your head. And so there isn't really a whole lot of reason to believe that Miles would somehow be able to overcome this so quickly, right? If you're trying to maintain that kind of comic book lore that we're used to and kind of maintain consistency, then, you know, it's something that you would kind of expect. But with Peter Parker able to overcome it as well, alongside Miles, they take out Mysterio pretty quickly, right? He's defeated pretty fast. And so from that point, what they end up doing is actually keeping Mysterio inside the Ultimate Universe. And the reason why is because Mysterio now knows that Peter Parker's Spider-Man. And so it kind of creates this situation where Peter's like, okay, cool, yeah, man, hold on to him. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for looking out. It's kind of a shady thing to do, but this is really the most important moment that comes out of this, right? Which is why we kind of more or less ham-fisted our way through this. There's a point where Peter and Miles are talking, and Peter basically thanks him for keeping the legacy of Spider-Man going. And when Miles asks him, like, does that mean that I have your blessing? Peter's like, absolutely. This was Brian Michael Bendis giving a big middle finger to the naysayers. And we talked about that before, that when Miles first showed up, there were a lot of people who were really pissy about the fact that Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe had been killed. And they didn't want Miles, they wanted Peter Parker. The response of Bendis is, you already have Peter Parker. You've had him for like 50 years, right? You've had Peter Parker for a long, long time. You need to get over yourselves, right? It's time for a new Spider-Man. It's time to kind of continue on this story, focusing on somebody else. We can't do that in the main Marvel universe because Peter Parker is etched in stone forevermore, the Spider-Man in the main Marvel universe. We can't change that. Marvel editorial won't let me change it, and even if I wanted to, it'd be a terrible idea to do it anyway. But in the Ultimate Universe, I created this character. Bendis giveth, Bendis taketh away. And that's kind of his stance on that. And so when you had a lot of people who were giving him flack and really complaining a lot on the various forum boards and social media, different things like that, about Miles Morales taking over the role of Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe, this was really Bendis saying, no, he's not going anywhere, right? If what you expected me to do was to basically give in, acquiesce, and admit defeat and say, hey, you know, you 50 comic book fans who sound like 5 million, obviously you guys don't like Miles Morales, so let me just get rid of him and bring back Peter Parker. If that's what you were expecting, then I'm sorry, you're gravely mistaken. That's not what's going to happen. And so we ended up just getting Miles Morales going forward. And so it's one of these things where with Miles kind of getting the official blessing of Peter Parker, that you have this moment where Nick Fury kind of pulls him aside and says, you got his blessing, man. Like, you earned it, kid, right? If that Spider-Man, the real true Spider-Man, gives you his blessing, then you're good, right? Just go forward and do your superhero thing. So it's really not anymore of Nick Fury kind of questioning Miles anymore, kind of looking at him with a skewed eye, or really the only eye you can look at him with, and just kind of, you know, his one good eye, kind of look at him with a skewed eye, and then just kind of being like, Is he really gonna be a good Spider-Man? At this point, he kind of goes forward with a whole new level of confidence that he didn't really have before. And that's kind of a cool thing, because what you do is you switch over to Peter Parker himself back home, right? Back in his own apartment. He's like, Miles Morales, Miles Morales. I wonder if we have a Miles Morales in the main Marvel universe. And then it ends. Now, of course, we know, as far as I'm aware, that's not true in Marvel Comics, right? The story was told like 8 years ago. So we know that's not really true. At the time this was written, everybody wanted to know if it was true or not. It was like the biggest cliffhanger of like a decade, right? Like, I wonder if they really do have a Miles Morales in the main Marvel universe. And it's like, I wonder what's gonna happen with that, right? It's kind of crazy, but okay, so we are covering probably the most important Miles Morales story in the history of Marvel Comics, but also one of the more controversial stories that Marvel had done in the history of Marvel in recent years, which is Ultimate End. Now, a little bit of backstory, because this does tie into Secret Wars and is a part of Secret Wars. So for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with how Secret Wars unfolded in 2015, which seems to be the version that we're gonna be getting when it comes to the Secret Wars film in the MCU, that this all started with a variety of things, right? You'll find a link to the entire playlist in the comments section, but what this did is it basically gave us the collapse of the multiverse. Now, I'm not gonna go into detail in terms of how all that happened. Check out the video for that. But what is important here is that with the collapse of the multiverse, Dr. Doom had basically seized the power of the Beyonders for himself, which effectively made him God. And in doing so, what he ended up basically doing was pulling together different pieces of alternate realities across the multiverse and combining them into a kind of patchwork called Battleworld. And so you literally have all these different alternate realities just kind of sitting side by side. So you have like the Marvel Zombies universe, and then like right next to it is the Age of Ultron universe, where Ultron conquered everything, right? It's just this small isolated pocket. And you can go from one place to the next, although you're not supposed to, right? Like they're not supposed to cross from what's called a domain. So you're not supposed to leave your domain and go to a different one. And so what matters here and what's important here is that this entire story takes place within the confines of Battleworld itself. But there are going to be things that people who are familiar with Secret Wars are going to be asking about. I will clarify all that stuff by the time we get to the end of the video. But what this does is it initially opens up with the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe meeting and talking. Now, this is kind of cool, because what had happened here at the very beginning of Secret Wars in issue number 0 is you had the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe as the last two universes in existence. Everything else had basically been wiped out. They were on a collision course. It was the final incursion. They were all fighting each other, and then everything blinked, right? Because of Dr. Doom and all that stuff, everything basically collided, it blinked, and then Battleworld came into existence. So one thing that I do want to establish here is that, like most people across the entirety of the Battleworld Secret Wars event, most people don't actually know the truth of what Dr. Doom did. All they know is the life that Dr. Doom gave them and the fact that Dr. Doom rules from on high. And that's it. That's really all they know. And so what's kind of crazy here is Bendis sort of takes his own turn, and again, we'll make sense of all of this. He establishes that there was basically a kind of dimensional rift that had been established in the Ultimate Universe that had effectively combined the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe together into one single domain, that they used to be separate. Now, this is where things get a little murky, because what ends up happening here is we're visited, or at least we see the arrival of Peter Parker at this giant gathering. Now, there's also familiar faces here, right? Like Scott Summers, Emma Frost, so on and so forth. But Peter Parker showing up here and meeting with everybody, initially he's just kind of obsessed about the fact that everybody seems to know his identity. The bigger concern here that they have is that because the main Marvel Universe and because the Ultimate Universe were at one point two different domains, but their dimensional tampering led to the domains combining, that Dr. Doom may very well become aware of what it is that they've done. And that if he does, there's only one of two possibilities. Either he allows it to sort of continue on and just sort of do its thing, which presents a dangerous precedent because it means that other people in other domains can start experimenting with dimensional rifts and potentially discover the truth of what Dr. Doom did, or Dr. Doom will intervene in some capacity. And so this kind of splits the group in half. Those who say that they need to report their findings to Doom, and others who say they don't. And in fact, this really seems to be a stark contrast, no pun intended, between both versions of Tony Stark. And so this is where we get this kind of cool explanation, because we actually learn the basis behind this portal. Now, if you've been reading the Ultimate Universe, or at least you were at this point in time, you know all of this, right? So just bear with me for people who don't. So what happened here at a distant point in the past is that when Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe died, Miles Morales became the new Spider-Man. And initially fans weren't overly receptive to it. And so in order to just kind of put the kibosh on that and to establish that Miles wasn't going anywhere, Brian Michael Bendis, who was writing Miles at the time, wrote a story called Spiderman. And this involved involved the opening of a portal, which I want to say was by the Vulture, but I'm not going to swear to that basically saw Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe crossing over into the Ultimate Universe, and that's how he and Miles met for the very first time. They had a kind of adventure together, and then when Miles told Peter that the Peter Parker in his reality had died, the main Marvel Universe Spider-Man gave Miles his blessing and said, "You now have my blessing to become the Spider-Man in this universe, carry on the legacy of your reality's version of Peter Parker, go forth and be a superhero." And it was basically Bendis telling all the people who were not fans of Miles to shut up, and he wasn't going anywhere, and it worked. But what this story establishes is that the portal never actually was shut down. And so what ended up happening is the portal effectively exploded outward and then merged the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe into one single reality, and they've been here ever since. Right now, this is where things are kind of cool, and I think this is a good chance to explain this. The way that Secret Wars initially unfolded is that when it came to the collapse of the multiverse, there was no main Marvel Universe anymore, and there was no Ultimate Universe anymore, right? Like, there was nothing. It was simply just those superheroes who survived and those superheroes who were plucked from what few realities remained by Dr. Doom and thrown onto Battleworld. What Brian Michael Bendis is establishing here is that within Battleworld itself is a main Marvel Universe and an Ultimate Universe. It was basically Bendis trying to do his own thing and sort of wrap up the entirety of the Marvel Multiverse in his own way. But the thing about this is that once the groups separate and they go their own ways, this leads to the arrival of the Thor Corps. They are, by extension, the law of doom, right? So whenever they come down and they say, this is going to happen, everybody in Battleworld treats it as Doom's word, because the alternative is to be killed by the Thor Corps. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. That when they're told by the Thor Corps itself, do not mess with this dimensional gate, leave it alone, right? Have no involvement here whatsoever. So says the word of doom. Hawkeye challenges it, right? And Hawkeye says, no, that's not gonna happen, right? We're gonna do whatever it is that we need to do. And the Thor Corps kills him on the spot. Literally just eradicates him on the spot. Now that's one thing to understand, is under any normal circumstance, Thor could be rivaled by any number of heroes or villains who were out there, given varying degrees of power. The Thor Corps' power was elevated by Dr. Doom to allow them to overcome virtually any foe out there. The exception to this was when they met Thanos. When Thanos survived the collapse of the multiverse and he showed up with like the Coal Obsidian, right, like the Black Order and like the different villains, and just demolished the Thor Corps, which was amazing. Apocalypse did it too. This is why I tell you guys, you need to check out the playlist in the comments section after this video is done, because Avengers, New Avengers, Secret Wars, the greatest story ever told in the history of Marvel Comics. It's phenomenal. But of course, with Hawkeye being killed and the groups coming to the realization that at least for the moment, if they are gonna mess with this portal, they have to keep it hush-hush. They can't just go out there and just sort of do it brazenly. You end up having main Marvel Universe Iron Man and Ultimate Iron Man meeting with each other and kind of having a bit of a sit down, right? In a bit of a conversation. And in fact, it's one of these things where they sort of come to terms on how in the world could we possibly fix this, get things back to the way that they're supposed to be. So we have our domain, you have your domain, and that's effectively it. The other part of this is we get one of the coolest moments when it comes to like Ultimate Hulk fighting main Marvel Universe Hulk. And that's one of the cool things that did come out of Ultimate End to a degree, was that it was sort of a love letter for like all the different little battles and things that we'd wanted to see over the years but never really saw, right? Like who would win in a fight, Ultimate Hulk, main Marvel Hulk, which one of the two is the strongest, that kind of a thing. The way this kind of played out though is that you ended up having main Marvel Universe Bruce Banner, who was just kind of continuing his experiments and research into like dimensional rifts and so on and so forth, kind of the other half of the equation from what both Tony Starks were doing. But the Ultimate Banner showed up to meet him, and as the two of them were talking, you actually had this kind of disagreement between the two, which was surface level at best, and it was just a reason for Bendis to have these guys start fighting each other, which was awesome. Like, it was really cool for what it was. But the entire basis behind their disagreement is sort of an argument of futility, right? That Ultimate Universe Bruce Banner is very, very just cynical, right? And he is in a lot of ways a nihilist, just by virtue of him seeing the Incredible Hulk persona as more of a curse than anything else. He just kind of believes life is meaningless, right? There's no point in continuing on, and really even no point in anything at all. The difference here though is that Banner from the main Marvel Universe is a lot more hopeful. Now, a lot of this is because of what was going on with the character of the Incredible Hulk at this point in time, specifically Jason Aaron's run, which gave us a kind of reworked version of Professor Hulk, and so it was kind of a more powerful but also equally intelligent version of the Professor Hulk that we'd seen in years past, which was basically a Hulk with the mind of Bruce Banner, right? Just that kind of a thing. But with the two of these guys having totally different viewpoints that ultimately the cynicism of Bruce Banner from the Ultimate Universe just gets the better of literally main Marvel Universe Banner. And he refers to Ultimate Banner as a coward. And that leads to like tempers flaring, the two of them fighting, and then literally like main Marvel Universe Hulk just like sends Ultimate Hulk flying through the Raft prison, right? Riker's prison, where like all the superpowered beings in that area are being held. It literally just causes a riot. And one of the people who just starts inciting their wrath on everybody around there is the Punisher, which is amazing because this Earth 616 Punisher, right, the main Marvel Universe Punisher, this guy survived. This guy made it out, which is awesome. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure how I agree with that because during like the Secret Wars, or maybe it was the Punisher Last Days, I want to say it was Secret Wars though, Secret Wars issue number 0, when the world was ending, the Punisher like shows up in a bar where you have all these villains and he's like, such a pity. It's the end of the world and I have all these bullets. What am I gonna do with them? And he kills every villain in the bar. He just sprays them all down mercilessly. But the thing about this is that he actually ends up meeting his Ultimate Universe counterpart, which is kind of a funny thing because there's a bit of a fight between the two of them, and then main Marvel Universe Punisher just seemingly comes out on top, which is cool, right? It's just one of these cool little moments here. But again, like what you have here in a lot of ways is that with tempers flaring, with a lot of anger and resentment and rage and just frustration with this sort of overcrowded environment, right? These two realities crammed together, it was only a matter of time before things went to pot exceedingly fast. And so what this does pretty quickly actually is it leads to just like an all-out, almost kind of like a mini civil war among like the heroes and villains within this reality itself. Now, those individuals who are focusing more on the dimensional rift and so on and so forth, they're kind of hands-off, right? They're kind of doing their own thing. But this massive calamity and this massive battle does not go unnoticed. And in fact, there's a point where effectively Valeria ends up approaching Dr. Doom. Now, the thing about this, and the reason why it's so important, is because within the realm of Secret Wars itself, and as far as Dr. Doom goes, one of the things that he had done is he had found an alternate reality version of Susan Storm, Franklin Richards, and Valeria Richards, and then adopted them as his own. In effect, he stole the life of Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic. That was kind of his thing. And that actually becomes a major focal point towards the end of Secret Wars and the reason why it ends the way it does. But Valeria, being the head of the Science Foundation, right, the Future Foundation effectively, approaches him and says, given our intelligence, some kind of a dimensional rift was activated within the Ultimate Universe domain. And that led to the Ultimate Universe domain and the main Marvel Universe domain combining into one. And they're continuing to experiment with this despite being expressly told by your Thor Corps to stop doing it. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know what's on the other side of this dimensional rift. There may be nothing. There could potentially be everything. They could reach a realm beyond anything that we've ever discovered. The realm of gods, right? The one above all. Who really even knows, right? No one knows for sure. And she says, but even within the group itself, they're split. One half of the group believes they should report their findings to you. The other half believes they should continue operating in secret, all the while blissfully unaware that we know everything that they're doing. And so she asks him, what was even the point, right? Valeria asked Doom, like, what was even the point of allowing this to happen in the first place? Of putting two realities so close together, knowing that at some future point in time, they were going to end up combining by whatever manner and whatever means, and then just kind of sitting back and allowing complete and total pandemonium to unfold. Now, there's a reason for this, and we'll talk about why this reason exists in the first place, because what it does is it ties into the original version of Battle World that Dr. Doom had created before he had wiped everything out and started over again. And so where Valeria asks, like where Dr. Doom doesn't answer her, and Valeria asks, do you want us to step in? Do you want us to do anything? Like, you know, Dr. Doom's response is no, right? Like, do not do anything, let things unfold as they will. And she asked the question, but what happens if something takes place that we can't foresee? Something that happens that changes everything. Enter Miles Morales. Now, this is one of the most important parts of the story. And the reason for this is, again, when the multiverse ended in Secret Wars issue number 0, that what you had were these two kind of like life rafts. Really one for what were effectively the villains, if you want to call them that, right? The Ultimate Universe version of Mr. Fantastic, along with Thanos, his Cull Obsidian. And then in turn, you had the other raft, what were basically the good guys. Peter Parker Spider-Man, Miles Morales, the good Reed Richards from the main Marvel Universe, and a handful of others. That what had taken place here is that when the multiverse collapsed, those rafts actually just kind of existed out there in the ether and then ultimately arrived on Battleworld. Now, there was some time displacement hijinks and things like that that we're not going to get into. The point being, Miles Morales showing up here, he knows exactly what's going on. He understands exactly what's happening here. He knows everything that's taking place, and he's about to spill the beans, but not necessarily in the most direct way. In fact, he fires his webbing over everybody and just says, stop. Now, initially, he goes to explain everything, but Emma Frost basically steps up and says, look, as a psychic, psychic, I can tell you right now, if you tell them everything you know, none of them are going to believe you. They're all going to think you're crazy. The only way for them to know is to be shown. And so Emma Frost uses her telepathic ability to basically combine the minds, or at least to project the mind of Miles into the mind of everybody else here. And that's when they come into the realization of what's going on. Now, this is the explanation that I'm sure a lot of you guys have been waiting for. Hopefully you guys find it interesting. So when everything was going on with the multiversal collapse, right, the Beyonders and the Molecule Men and all that kind of stuff, that there was basically a last-ditch effort by Dr. Doom and the Molecule Man Owen Reese and Doctor Strange to defeat the Beyonders. They did this by taking all the Molecule Men that remained from across the multiverse, who were like these universe-sized bombs. Literally, when a Molecule Man dies, it blows up the whole universe. That what happened is all these Molecule Men were basically just thrown at the Beyonders and blew all the Beyonders up, and then eradicated basically all of the multiverse except for the main Marvel Universe and the Ultimate Universe itself. And so that's what set these two worlds on a collision course, assuming we ignore everything this Bendis has been doing with regards to the portal and the dimensional rift and all that kind of stuff. And so what happened here is that once Dr. Doom had seen the Beyonders defeated, he took the entirety of their power. Then he created the first version of Battleworld. Now, it's not directly mentioned here in the story, but the original version of Battleworld, as it was shown and discussed in Secret Wars from 2015, was that it was a place of suffering, right? It was just only the strong deserved to survive. Those individuals who were too weak were perished. It was like warfare almost 100% of the time. There was no light because there was no sun, and then Dr. Doom started to realize that this world was destined to fail. It was destined to fall apart. And so what had happened is that he had completely reworked the entirety of Battleworld, just reestablished everything. When Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four tried to fight him, he basically took away Johnny Storm's own ability to control himself, sent him out into what you could call space, kind of the area orbiting Battleworld, and turned him into the sun. And so he lights Battleworld now. And Battleworld had basically become what it is now, but all this information is spilled directly to everybody here by Miles Morales. That God King Doom is not some being who has always existed, and he's always been God, and he's all powerful, and you always have to listen to him. At one point, he was just a dude, and then attained just an insane level of power, and used it to recreate the entirety of the multiverse, and seize absolute control over everything. And so once they all start to realize what's going on, then they all realize, okay, now their main enemy is Dr. Doom. And so what ends up happening is they join basically everybody else in the final fight against Doom over at Doomstat. Now that's actually covered in the main Secret Wars story itself, but the funny thing about this is that with everything going on, what ends up happening is that all these different characters kind of start blinking out of existence, right? They kind of start disappearing. The reason behind this is because what's going on behind the scenes is the conclusion of the story, where Reed Richards and Dr. Doom are fighting, and the Molecule Man takes the power from Doom, gives it to Reed, and Reed recreates everything. So in effect, it's a reset, right? To a degree. I mean, Marvel should have rebooted, but they didn't because they were cowards. So basically, everybody kind of vanishes and things sort of go back to normal the way that they were supposed to. But the reason why this is so important for Miles Morales, right? It's one of the most important things for his character. When he gets back to the Ultimate Universe, when he's sleeping, he wakes up to his mom. Now, this is why this is so important, because his mom's dead, right? Now, there's a whole reason why this happens, and it's the reason that you would least expect, right? But Miles Morales gets his mom back. This sets everything going forward into the future of the Ultimate Universe. Miles in the main Marvel Universe is part of all new, all different Marvel. So for the guys who are always curious how it is that Miles' mom came back to life, this was it, right? This is how she came back. It was a gift from the Molecule Man, Owen Reese, for one of the coolest things that Miles Morales ever could have done. It was phenomenal. Okay, so we are getting into Spider-Man 2, and this is actually a really cool story to me. Like, it was a really interesting story, but people who picked this up, and rightfully so, they immediately compared it to Spider-Man 1. And the reason why was because Spider-Man 1 was in a lot of ways this pretty significant story when it comes to the Spider-Man landscape. And the reason why is actually just the nature of the history of Spider-Man. So a little bit of history here. During the mid-90s comic bust, Marvel came up with this idea that if they were going to basically kind of experience the second renaissance of readership, which is to say regain an audience base, they were going to have to find a way to basically take their existing superhero roster and update it for the modern day. The problem is that Marvel's always had cold feet when it comes to rebooting. While their continuity and their history is pretty linear in terms of the fact that it all follows a straight path, the fact remains it can be very confusing when it comes to characters, especially with things like Spider-Man, who have had 3, 4, 5 different publications over the course of his entire history. And so the idea was that in the early 2000s, under Brian Michael Bendis, Marvel launched something called the Ultimate Universe. And the Ultimate Universe was basically taking their existing heroes and then updating them for the modern reader. So Marvel kind of got the best of both worlds. They got a quote-unquote reboot of sorts while not actually rebooting. In the Ultimate Universe, you got a whole new set of stories, all new origins, events transpired in different ways. Now for Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe, originally it was Ultimate Peter Parker, and it made sense. I mean, if you were going to launch Ultimate Spider-Man, you had to start with Peter Parker since he's so iconic. That ran for about 150 some odd issues, and then Marvel killed him off. And the idea was that they replaced Ultimate Peter Parker with Miles Morales, which Bendis and Sarah Pichelli had made. And so with Miles Morales becoming the new Spider-Man, initially there was a lot of resistance to it. I mean, you go back and you look at old forum posts, you go back and you look at old articles, and a lot of people were really against the idea of Miles Morales for a variety of different reasons. And so the result was that where there was some apprehension there, in order to basically kind of satisfy the readership and to establish this in-continuity explanation that Miles Morales was here to stay, Brian Michael Bendis wrote a story called Spider-Man. And what Spider-Man did is it basically had Mysterio, I think it was, find a way to cross over into the Ultimate Universe from the main Marvel Universe. This, of course, brought Peter Parker Spider-Man from the main Marvel Universe, and he met Miles Morales for the very first time. And it was basically Miles explaining his whole history to the main Marvel Peter Parker, how the Ultimate Peter Parker died, and so on and so forth. And it was the main Marvel Peter Parker giving his blessing and saying, while everybody else may question the fact that you should or should not be Spider-Man, I'm okay with this. And so it was basically Marvel saying, shut up, Miles Morales is going to be here for a while. And so he's been here ever since, and as time progressed, because of the fact that Marvel didn't really give the readership a choice, people just basically began to grow on Miles Morales. But the fact remains here that with Miles in this scenario, following the events of Secret Wars 2015, Marvel basically canceled out the Ultimate Universe, and they basically brought Miles and Peter into the same universe. Marvel Prime is what they call it now. Now, it was not a reboot. There was no new origin for Miles or anything like that. Things just kind of continued on. So you could literally start with Ultimate Miles Morales Spider-Man and then just read all the way through to Secret Wars and then pick up with all new, all different Marvel, and it's one seamless story. It just keeps going on as if it never stopped. And so the result is that a lot of the themes that went on with Miles and his Ultimate Universe stories continue on in all new, all different Marvel, Marvel Now, and Marvel Legacy, and so on and so forth, in the sense that he's still just a kid trying to deal with the fact that he's Spider-Man, that he's got abilities. Now, over the course of the publication histories with stories like Spider-Verse by Dan Slott, things like that, it's demonstrated the fact that Miles has really kind of come into his own, and he's really growing comfortable in his own skin, so to speak, with regards to being Spider-Man. But it does create a bit of tension here, because in a lot of ways, Peter Parker looks at where he was as a teenager, and he looks at Miles Morales and says, Miles Morales is where I used to be. And so he's really been this kind of guiding force in terms of helping Miles along the way, navigating these uncharted waters in the life of Miles with regards to being Spider-Man, different things along those lines. So it's very much a mentor-protege relationship between the two. But with the story picking up about a week before the present day, so to speak, at the time the story is being written, initially just kind of, follows up with this idea of just some massive surge of energy that really kind of explodes in the city of New York. And it is kind of interesting because at that point, it switches over to the Brooklyn Visions Academy, of course, where Miles Morales is going to school, and he basically ends up meeting a girl named Barbara. Now, Barbara Rodriguez has kind of been a girl that Miles is interested in, but hasn't really noticed her too much. The result is that where Genki kind of plays wingman, basically, and really kind of ropes in Barbara Rodriguez and helps to introduce the two of them together, it's immediately obvious there is a budding romance between the two. And that's the cool thing about this, is that when it comes to the Spider-Man legacy, is always the idea of stepping into that role of developing relationships between two characters. For Peter Parker, originally it was Betty Brant, then it went into Gwen Stacy, then it went into Mary Jane Watson, of course, which ended with Spider-Man One More Day, and he's more or less kind of been single ever since. There was that one girl he was dating during Big Time, but that didn't last too long. And so, of course, again, it is pretty interesting in terms of this whole idea with Miles, because it does set the stage for future stories. Now, remember, this is Brian Michael Bendis' last story on Spider-Man. It's the last thing he's writing here. So again, we're not going to see a whole lot coming out of this. It's whatever future writers choose to do, if they choose to do anything at all. Now, of course, in the middle of this idea of Miles trying to spit some game on Barbara, we end up having a giant robot head that crash lands. He basically ends up pairing up with Peter Parker, and the two of them go to poke around and see what it is that's happening. Now, ultimately, what ends up taking place here is that this rift is like a portal of sorts. Where it leads to, we have no earthly clue, but it does result in the arrival of Taskmaster. Now, we have talked about Taskmaster. Specifically, we talked about him with regards to the whole idea of rolling Deadpool over into the Marvel Cinematic Universe and different things like that. But Taskmaster is really one of the most dangerous villains who exists out there. Well, he's kind of a villain, kind of not. He's really more of a middleman. Sometimes he helps out heroes, sometimes he helps out villains. He'll do almost anything you want to if you pay him enough money to do it. Of course, he has been sent on a mission here, and we'll find out what that mission is. And this whole scenario, it kind of deviates for a second, and it picks up at a place called Bloomfield Hills. And the reason why this matters is because a man who's walking his dog, whose face is scarred, is addressed by a woman who refers to him as Miles Morales. And so this is huge, because what this does is this introduces a second second version of Miles into Marvel Comics, which is something that we haven't actually seen before. Now, of course, switching back over to Taskmaster, this is interesting because Taskmaster is probably the best fighter in Marvel Comics, to be honest. I would argue Taskmaster is better than like Wolverine, probably better than Captain America, because Taskmaster has developed his fighting skills in such a way that if he fights an opponent long enough, he'll basically become their fighting style, and he'll actually be able to predict what they do before they do it. But the issue with this is that whatever mission Taskmaster's been on, he'd basically been sent on that mission by this other version of Miles Morales. Scarred Miles is you know, we could probably get away with calling him that. So it is kind of an interesting mission here, because remember, for Miles Morales Spider-Man, a lot of the stuff that goes on with regards to the various heroes he's fighting is new to him. In the Ultimate Universe, he was relatively familiar with all the things that went on, with the various enemies that were there, different things like that. But because of the fact that a lot of the characters from the main Marvel Universe were revamped and reworked in the Ultimate Universe, when Secret Wars happened and he was moved over to the main Marvel Universe, characters like Taskmaster, as he existed there, is not really someone Miles is familiar with. And so he's not really used to the kind of trickery, the kind of deception the Taskmaster uses. I mean, in this instance, for example, Miles goes to attack Taskmaster and is basically shocked by the suit that he's wearing. It's just not something he expects. The other half of this is that Miles, his whole, instigation for attacking Taskmaster is due to the fact that with Taskmaster on the phone, he basically said that he's answering to a guy named Miles Morales. And what this does is this brings Miles Morales Spider-Man into the mindset of asking the question, who's this other version of Miles? What in the world is going on? Now, Peter's initial response here is to kind of dismiss it to a degree. And the reason why is because following the events of Spider-Man, one of the first things that Marvel did is they had the main Marvel Universe version of Peter Parker look up his own version of Miles Morales, which, as far as this story's telling us, didn't exist. Instead, all you had was just Miles from the Ultimate Universe, and that was really about it. Now, of course, there were a few things that went on behind the scenes, but the idea of Peter is to say, look, Taskmaster fights in a variety of different ways. The longer you fight him, the more like you he becomes. Just take my lead, listen to what I tell you, everything will be fine. But it's very dismissive. Peter doesn't really try to get in the head of Miles. It's just kind of like, hey man, look, this is how the game gets played. All right, he's probably messing with your head. It's what villains do. Just move on. Don't read too much into it. But if you're Miles Morales and you come from a universe that doesn't exist anymore, you're still gaining your bearings with regards to the universe you're currently in, and then suddenly somebody references another version of yourself, your immediate instinct is to say, what in the world is going on? This is kind of cool, because what we end up finding out here is that where Peter was initially dismissive, instead, he followed up behind the scenes. And what he did is he actually went to Jessica Jones, which is cool because, of course, Miles and Jessica have met before. But Jessica Jones is really kind of like the premier detective in Marvel Comics. I mean, she's not Batman level, but she's a really, really good detective in terms of getting the kind of information she needs. I mean, for example, when she was originally introduced, she figured out Captain America's identity as Steve Rogers, which was being kept hidden from the general public for quite some time. Now, also remember, it's not an accident she's in this story. Brian Michael Bendis made her. And so if this story is going to be kind of like Brian Michael Bendis' swan song to all the different things that he's done, then it makes perfect sense to grab two of the most iconic characters he's made and kind of throw them together in the same story, even if it's not for any real measure of time. While Jessica Jones is here, it's explicitly for the purpose of Peter bringing Miles over and saying, I had Jessica do as much research as she could. She's dug up some dirt. She's talked to all these different people, and she came back with nothing. There's no one out there named Miles Morales that she's aware of. And if there is someone out there named Miles Morales, no one knows anything about him. And so what this story does is it basically grabs the idea that, yeah, I mean, we know there's another version of Miles Morales out there. They're trying to find out who he is, but maybe the guy is just so well hidden, he doesn't want to be found. And if he doesn't want to be found, then the question is, why? Well, fortunately for us, Brian Michael Bendis gives us this backstory to a degree. He doesn't go super in depth. He gives us just enough to really kind of satiate this line of questioning that we have. What we end up doing here is jumping back several years ago to the early days of Wilson Fisk. And this is interesting because when it comes to Kingpin, there really isn't a whole lot known about his past. In fact, there's really nothing there in terms of an origin. There's no like Kingpin #0 or there's no line of stories called like the life and times of Wilson Fisk. But what this also does is it feeds on Daredevil, the Man Without Fear. Now, Daredevil, the Man Without Fear was a series that was written in 1993, I'm pretty sure, and it focused really kind of on the nature of Daredevil himself. But the idea here is that it offered this explanation that back before Wilson Fisk became the Kingpin, that he basically served as an enforcer for a guy named Don Rigoletto. And Don Rigoletto was just the guy who was running the mob scene before Kingpin did. Now, eventually Kingpin kind of rose to prominence and replaced Don Rigoletto. But at the time, this little bit of a story right here with regards to Spider-Man 2, this really kind of picks up during the events of Kingpin being an enforcer for Don Rigoletto. Now, of course, like any depiction of prison life with regards to Marvel Comics, as soon as Kingpin gets in there, it's immediately establishing establishing he's not a guy to be messed around with. Now, of course, a lot of this is done for the purpose of really kind of showing us that the groundwork is being laid for him to become the Kingpin, which is to say, take over the entire crime scene in Hell's Kitchen and throughout the city of New York. But we also end up having this first encounter between Wilson Fisk and this other version of Miles Morales. And what we end up finding out here is that this other version of Miles Morales is of course much older, but he's basically serving a prison sentence to cover for somebody else. But because it seems to have been done either as a favor or as just something of his own accord, but in some form or fashion benefits Don Rigoletto basically sent Kingpin into prison for the purpose of showing his appreciation to Miles Morales and essentially saying, you're going to be taken care of after this. Now, the other half of this is forming a relationship between Kingpin and this other version of Miles. And the reason for that is because this other version of Miles had basically been contracted by one of the guys to take out Kingpin. And so it's basically building trust between the two of them. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to Wilson Fisk, earning his trust is a very, very difficult thing to do. But when it's done, you have it forever. And he will do virtually anything you ask, so long as it doesn't cost him what's important to him, or it doesn't challenge his ability to rule over the crime scene in New York. Now, this friendship that forms between the two of them is huge in a lot of different ways, because where Kingpin is, more or less taking a shower and then ultimately met by one of the guys that tries to kill him, instead, what ends up happening is Miles just kind of shows up out of nowhere and kills this guy attacks this guy that's trying to kill Kingpin, ultimately ends up killing him. Of course, it results in this older version of Miles or this other version of Miles receiving scars, which is why his face is scarred in the present day in the first place. But the fact that he stepped in and he saved the life of Kingpin is a very big deal, because this is one of those things where Wilson Fisk does not forget. But because of the fact that Wilson Fisk and this other version of Miles had formed such a strong friendship together, what they've basically done here is they've kind of gone out and formed off their own little branch of criminal activity, and their actions do not necessarily go unnoticed. But in the interim, what ends up happening is this other version of Miles, this scarred Miles Morales, falls in love with a woman named Barbara. And this is cool, because with the whole, really the two of them meeting one another, kind of having this conversation, it does show the idea of a better life. And that's ultimately what begins to come to fruition here. Now, of course, in the interim, we end up having Wilson Fisk and this scarred Miles making their move against Don Rigoletto, basically taking over his empire and killing him in the process. But the fact remains, in a conversation between the two, which is probably one of the coolest conversations that I've read in comics in a long, long time, is basically the scarred Miles wanting to get out of this life. Now, remember, this is part and parcel to the nature of the characters. For Wilson Fisk, because he is so synonymous with being the Kingpin, it's always basically been alluded to that he's always longed to run the criminal empire, or at the very least, to have this extreme level of power when it comes to political influence and different things like that, to have his will be done. And so because of that, it was always one of these things where it's like he was destined to become the Kingpin. But for this scarred version of Miles, he was kind of thrown into a situation he wasn't really ready for. He's not really sure this is what he wants to do. What he wants is happiness. And that's the coolest thing about this. It's one of the reasons why I love Brian Michael Bendis when it comes to developing characters, because he focuses so much on the motivation of the character, more so than them just fighting people. Now, with this scenario, scarred Miles wants to basically marry Barbara, this blonde woman he went on a date with. He wants to take her hand, he wants to take his money and run, and he wants to be gone. He wants to be away from all this. He wants to find some small measure of peace. And that's what's cool. It's because Wilson Fisk says, then it shall be done. If that's what you want, then that's what will happen. It all fits into the idea that as long as you maintain his trust, as long as you don't betray him, he'll go to the ends of the earth to make sure that you want for nothing. The problem with this is that somewhere along the line, and for reasons that are unexplained, Barbara had died. And what this effectively did is it stripped this older version of Miles from almost his entire will to live. He had no real desire to continue on. In his mind, it's just kind of giving up. Now, this is a very, very, very important conversation, because what this does is it stems from the nature of Wilson Fisk and his wife, Vanessa. Now, in Marvel Comics, Vanessa had basically killed her own son just because of the fact that her son, Richard, was trying to take out Wilson Fisk. The problem was that she was suffering from a disease at the same time, and it really just kind of resulted in Vanessa kind of losing the will to live, eventually dying. But the idea behind this is that Wilson Fisk basically says, I tried every form and every piece of technology and everything out there. I used almost every resource I had to find a way to basically bring Vanessa back. I learned that there were alternate universes, there were alternate dimensions, but I found satisfaction in knowing that there had to be another version of her out there. Basically, it's Wilson Fisk saying, you will not be with Barbara the way she is. The way that you remember her, that version of Barbara is gone. But you can find some measure of comfort in knowing that there is a Barbara out there somewhere who is finding happiness. That if there is a multiverse, then in other universes somewhere, you and Barbara are happy together. Now, where this is no real measure of comfort for Miles, just because of the fact that he's looking at the moment saying, I don't care about, the possibility that there might be alternate universes. What I care about is the here and now. At the end of the day, it is Wilson kind of reaching out to his friend and trying to help him him find a way to essentially deal with this whole scenario. Now, of course, what this does is it kind of moves up, back to the modern day, picking up with Spider-Man Miles Morales as well as Peter Parker. Now, of course, this leads to Miles kind of going about his nightly routine, so on and so forth, and then eventually stumbling across the actions of a Taskmaster who's doing whatever it is that he's doing, and of course, Miles following him along the way. This ultimately brings in the whole idea of Peter Parker really showing up and referencing the events of Spider-Man 1 and the first time he and Miles met each other. And this is really cool because what he does is kind of impart these words of wisdom to Miles. Again, really playing out this mentor relationship where Miles is, youthful. That really plays itself out in a variety of different ways. One of the things to notice here is that while Miles has struggled and where Miles has, lost important members of his family, at the end of the day, he hasn't really experienced it on the same level as Peter Parker. With Peter Parker, he lost Gwen Stacy in the night Gwen Stacy died because of a moment of recklessness. The death of Uncle Ben, different things like that, those all went towards the idea that Peter Parker basically learned over the course of his life that you can't be reckless. If you have the ability to act, you have the responsibility to act, different things like that. Miles still is still learning a lot of those lessons. And so that's really kind of Peter's response to this is, hey, look, with great power comes great responsibility. Stop being reckless. If there are answers out there, the answers will come in time. And this really kind of comes to fruition in the sense that with regards to Taskmaster boarding this plane, once Miles sees what's happening, he kind of shouts out, no, Taskmaster of course hears him and blows up the building that Peter and Miles are on. Now, of course, this leads to a direct battle between Taskmaster, Peter, and Miles, or at least it seems to. The problem is they're knocked unconscious, and the scarred version of Miles simply says, let's go. The trap that Kingpin always falls into is he has to stop Spider-Man. He's got to be the one to win. We're not even going to worry about that. We've got a goal, so we're just going to leave him here. We're not going to waste our time with this. That's one of the things you guys notice, when it comes to business. In a lot of comic book stories, you'll see these tropes, right? It'll be like, okay, now that I've got you tied up, let me explain the entirety of my plan. I will give you all the time in the world to loosen your grip. When, I'm done explaining my plan, it will conveniently happen at the same time that you freed yourself and then I'll be defeated. It's one of those things where it's like, why didn't the villain just shoot the hero in the face? But what we end up finding out here is the mission Taskmaster was sent on by this scarred version of Miles was to see if there were different universes out there, one of which held a version of Barbara. And the answer to that question is yes. There is another universe out there that holds a version of Barbara that this scarred version of Miles is looking for. In response to this also picks up with the plane taking off, Taskmaster basically making his return and facing off against Miles and Peter. Now, this is kind of cool because what this does is serve as a distraction of sorts, where Taskmaster is just there to keep, Miles Morales, Spider-Man, and Peter Parker distracted while scarred Miles goes off and does his own thing. And it works because, of course, when this portal is open and when he begins stepping through, Miles Morales Spider-Man kind of pops up and says, look, what's the deal with you? My name is Miles Morales too. Tell me what's going on. Give me an ending to this story. The problem is that Miles doesn't get one. And that's the interesting thing here because where he's shot through the shoulder, Taskmaster ends up making his escape. Miles Morales Spider-Man, Peter Parker emerge from the rubble, and Miles Morales Spider-Man's angry because there's no resolution here. But Peter Parker's response is, and that's usually how it goes. There's not always a resolution. Sometimes you don't find out what the motivations of the villain is. The villain just gets away. And you never find out why they did what they did. You never find out what the secret behind them was. Sometimes there is no great big huge master plan. That's one of the things that Miles kind of has to learn to deal with. And it's one of the things that Peter Parker's passing on to him. Sometimes it's not necessarily the heroes beat the villain and ride off into the sunset. Sometimes the villain just runs off. And that's really about it. It's very, realistic in terms of how it's depicted, different things like that. But what we end up finding out here is picking up with scarred Miles Morales, of course, arriving in this alternate universe, this alternate reality. He, of course, kind of walks into a bar and finds that bar's version of Barbara. It allows him to kind of reconnect, to regain this life he was looking for. Now, in the middle of it all, we end up having, this massive explosion, different things like that. And in response to that, of course, is this alternate reality version of Spider-Man. And I think you guys understand what direction this story is going in, because this alternate version of Spider-Man fighting against some force, looks up to the rest of the people who were there. And what we find out is this is the ultimate universe. The ultimate universe is still exists. The Ultimate Universe is back, guys. That's how the story ends. It ends with the return of the Ultimate Universe. Now, the question is, what does this mean for Marvel Legacy? What does it mean, for example, with this version of Thor still in existence? What does that mean for War Thor? I have no idea. This is Brian Michael Bendis at his best. Well, I really want to bring back the Ultimate Universe, so done. Ultimate Universe is here, and all the characters you're familiar with the Ultimate Universe are here. But what about Thor? Well, this is Brian Michael Bendis at his best. He wants to do it, so he's going to do it. And that's just the way it is. There's no explanation of how Thor fits in with anything else, how Ultimate Iron Man fits in with anything else. There's no real explanation in terms of how this fits in. And there, of course, it'll be after Brian Michael Bendis is gone, it'll be some other writer that has to pick this up and basically try to find a way to work this in to the rest of the larger Marvel landscape. escape. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.